The door did not open. It surrendered. A low, guttural groan of rusted steel giving way, the kind of sound a building makes when it has finally accepted its own decay, swallowed whole by the dead corridor beyond. No echo, no response, just the suffocating quiet of a tenement that had long since stopped expecting anything good to walk through its doors. Park Kayubong was not good. He had never been good. But tonight, for the first time in 23 years of building his empire on the wreckage of other men's spines, he was something far more dangerous than good or evil. He was dying. He crossed the threshold the way a dynasty ends, not with a battle cry, but with a wet, ragged exhale that tore at the lining of his lungs and echoed in the hollow of his own ribcage. His shoulder caught the doorframe. His palm found the peeling wallpaper. The corridor tilted, and he let it, redistributing his weight with the last reserves of a body that had been told, in very clear and very final terms, that its debt was due. The bullet had entered clean. Nothing about what followed had been. His free hand pressed flat against his left side, fingers splayed over the ruin beneath his shirt, a shirt that had cost 400,000 won and now served as a burial cloth for the life draining steadily through the gaps between his fingers. The iron smell of it rose to meet him. He knew that smell. He had made that smell countless times in rooms not so different from this one. He had never before been the one producing it. His neck tattoos, the dark, coiling dragons that subordinates had spent entire careers avoiding eye contact with, disappeared beneath a collar soaked through to transparency. His suit jacket hung off one shoulder, shredded at the lapel where a blade had found him before the bullet did. 3 men. His own. Men he had fed, promoted, trusted with the architecture of his empire. Men who had decided, apparently with great efficiency, that the architecture required a new foundation. He told himself he would reach the floor. Cold concrete. No witnesses. He had survived 12 assassination attempts with planning, with violence, with the brute force of a will that refused to accommodate death on anyone else's schedule. Tonight there was no plan. Tonight there was only the floor, and the dignified intention of meeting it before his legs made the decision for him. He did not reach the floor. He found her first. She was standing beside a narrow bed in the far corner of the room, barefoot on a rug so worn through at its center that the concrete beneath showed like a scar. The light, a single bulb overhead with the confidence of a candle, caught the colors on her fingers first. Waxy smears of crayon orange, ocean blue, the particular yellow of a child who has been drawing suns long enough to know exactly how much pressure turns a line into light. Alyssa Williams. Kayubong's predatory eyes, the eyes that subordinates described in hushed terms as having no warm center, only a cold and calculating iris that cataloged threat and utility and nothing else, swept the room in the half-second before his vision blurred again. Reflex. Survival architecture so deeply embedded it fired even now, even bleeding, even here. He assessed her the way he assessed every room he entered. Small, 7 years old, perhaps less. A faded blue dress, overwashed to the particular softness of things that have been clung to. No visible threat, no adult presence, no exit he hadn't already identified. His hand moved toward the blade at his waistband. It was not a decision. It was 23 years of staying alive compressing itself into a single, instinctive motion. In his world, unexpected meant dangerous. Small did not mean safe. He had learned that lesson from a man half his size in a parking structure in Incheon when he was 19 years old, and he had never unlearned it. He never finished the motion. Because Alyssa Williams looked at him, and she did not flinch. Not at the tattoos climbing his throat like dark water rising. Not at the crimson architecture spreading across the white of his shirt in the slow, geometric pattern of a wound that had been working for a while. Not at the predatory weight behind eyes that had, at various points in the last 2 decades, been the last thing a number of men had seen with full clarity. She looked at him the way you look at something you have already decided to fix. And then she raised one small finger to her lips. SHH. It was not a sound. It was a transfer of authority, issued without theater, without hesitation, with the total executive certainty of someone who understood that the corridor behind him was still listening. Her eyes moved past his shoulder, into the dark of the hallway beyond the open door, reading it the way he read exits. Then they returned to his face, and they did not waver. Park Kyu-bong, who had silenced rooms by walking into them, who had ended arguments by exhaling, stood in the doorway of a basement apartment and felt the word die in his throat before it had formed. He did not speak. He did not strike. He did not fully understand in that specific moment why neither of those things happened. Later, in the days that followed in the strange, suspended half-life of that basement, when he had enough stillness to excavate the moment, he would understand it as the first genuine surprise of his adult life. A man who trades in fear develops a comprehensive taxonomy of human response. Screaming, freezing, running, begging. He had cataloged all of them so thoroughly they had stopped registering as human and started registering as data. He had no category for this. For a child who looked at a bleeding monster and saw, apparently, a scheduling problem she intended to solve. Alyssa stepped toward him, one bare foot then the other, moving across the threadbare rug with the particular efficiency of someone who did not believe in wasted motion. She pressed her small shoulder beneath his arm, the arm not holding his wound, and her frame buckled slightly under the redistribution of weight before it steadied. She was stronger than she looked. Or perhaps she was simply more committed than he was, which, at this particular moment, was a low bar. She guided him toward the bed. He let her. This was the fact that would return to him, later, with the quality of a wound that reopens. He let her. Not because he had no choice. Not because the blood loss had stripped his agency. In the 5 steps between the doorframe and the faded quilt, he made a decision, not with thought, but with something older than thought, to be led. By 7 years of age and crayon-stained fingers and a gravity that should not have fit inside a child's face. He collapsed onto the mattress, and the ceiling swam. Above him, through the concrete and the plumbing and the indifferent architecture of the building, the bass from the gilded dragon pulsed in a muffled, rhythmic thud. The heartbeat of the empire he had bled to build. Still beating. Still indifferent to the fact that its king was currently horizontal on a child's quilt. Staring up at water stains on a basement ceiling, while life continued to leave him through the gaps in his fingers. The room smelled like old crayons, like laundry soap still warm from a dryer at the end of its life, like something so ordinary and clean that it sat against the iron smell of his wound, the way silence sits against a scream. His hand found the blade at his waistband. Reflex again. The last reflex of a man whose body had not yet received the message that this room did not operate by his rules. Alyssa caught his wrist. Not hard, not with the grabbing urgency of fear, with the calm, redirecting pressure of someone who had already considered this possibility and decided on her response. She moved his hand away from the knife, away from the waistband, down to the quilt, and released it. Then she turned, crouched beside the bed, and retrieved something from the floor. She placed it in his open palm. A plastic stethoscope, pink, printed along the tubing with small cartoon kittens in various states of medical authority. One end was slightly chewed, the way children chew things they carry everywhere. It was the most beloved object in this room, and she had just given it to him. She pressed the disc end against his chest, over the ruins of his shirt, and leaned forward slightly, listening. Her face arranged itself into an expression of focused, professional concern that belonged on someone 4 decades older, and she nodded once, a small, decisive nod, the nod of a diagnosis being filed. In that moment, Park Kyu-bong understood something that none of his enemies, his allies, or his mirror had ever managed to communicate. He was not the Iron King in this room. He was a patient. The only physician available was barefoot and currently deciding, with great seriousness, whether his heartbeat was satisfactory. He closed his eyes. Above him, the bass continued. Somewhere in the building's upper corridors, the sound that he had trained himself to sleep beside, the sound of his own empire running without his supervision, thumped on, indifferent and relentless. And somewhere beyond the walls of this basement, boots were already moving through the district in a pattern he recognized. Systematic, grid-based, the way his own men cleaned a location when they wanted no witnesses left standing. They were looking for him. They were also, he knew, looking for everyone else. He had one hand pressed to a wound that was no longer bleeding quite as fast. Something about horizontal, something about the body's reluctant negotiations with survival, and in his other hand, a pink plastic stethoscope with cartoon kittens on it. The man who had built an empire on the principle that fear was the only honest currency between human beings lay in the dark of a basement that smelled like a child's laundry and felt, for the first time in 23 years, something adjacent to safe. I've used this hand to authorize things I won't name in daylight, and I couldn't even close my fingers around a plastic toy. The billions sitting in my accounts couldn't buy a single breath of air that clean. She didn't see the monster the whole city had spent 2 decades building. She saw a patient who needed managing. And the most terrifying thing, the thing I still can't fully account for, is that she was right. Somewhere above the bass, above the boots, above the cold efficiency of men following a grid pattern through a district full of people who had been invisible so long they'd forgotten, they had the right to be seen. Somewhere in the upper floors of that building, a door handle turned. The night shift was ending. And Trisha Williams, who had perfected the art of invisibility as a survival strategy, who wanted nothing more than the cool surface of her own door and the proof of her daughter's sleeping face, was about to open a room that had changed the rules of her life while she was carrying trays and being looked through. She would smell the blood before she saw him. She would see the quilt before she understood. And she would find her daughter, her 7-year-old daughter with the gravity no child should carry, sitting in the chair beside the bed of the most dangerous man in Seoul, her plastic stethoscope still around her neck. Asleep, peaceful, guarding. The question that would break open in Trisha's chest when that door swung wide wasn't whether to call for the reward money, wasn't whether to run. It was simpler and far more devastating. How long has my daughter been this brave, and how did I not know? The gilded dragon ate people in shifts. Trisha Williams had learned this in her first week, not from a manager, not from the laminated employee handbook that lived in the break room beneath a coffee ring and someone's abandoned resignation letter, but from her own body. The way her spine cataloged each hour differently. The first 2 hours were just work. By hour 4, the weight of the trays had moved from her arms into something deeper, a dull renegotiation happening somewhere behind her shoulder blades. By hour 8, she was no longer carrying plates. She was being carried by the momentum of a shift that had long since stopped asking her permission to continue. She took the stairs instead of the service elevator because the elevator had a mirror, and she had learned, some months ago, that there was a particular kind of exhaustion that you should not look directly at. 4 flights. The bass from the club above diminished with each landing, not disappearing, but retreating, the way a headache retreats when you finally step out of the noise that was causing it and realize how much of yourself you had been clenching against the sound. By the bottom flight, it was a ghost of a vibration in the handrail. A reminder that the city above her was still consuming, still indifferent, still gloriously unaware that the woman carrying its champagne flutes had not eaten a full meal since Tuesday. She had given the last of the ramen to Alyssa. This was not a sacrifice she had named or dramatized, even inside her own head. It was simply a mathematics she performed automatically now, the same way she automatically chose the chair with the uneven leg at work so no one else had to sit in it. Trisha Williams had been making herself smaller and quieter and less present for long enough that the habit had dissolved into personality. She was invisible by practice, invisible by necessity. Invisible in the specific way that a woman becomes when the city has looked through her enough times that she begins to wonder if the city might be right. She reached the bottom landing. The corridor greeted her the way it always did, with the particular silence of a space that exists between other spaces, belonging to no one and therefore holding the cold of the concrete without any warmth to offset it. The single bulb at the far end had been flickering for 11 days. She had reported it. No one had come. She navigated the familiar darkness without adjusting her pace, her key already between her fingers, the particular muscle memory of a woman who had lived at the bottom of things long enough to know every texture of the way home. She noticed the door first. Not open, not ajar, just wrong, The specific wrongness of a threshold that has been disturbed recently, the frame not quite settled back into its usual resignation. Trisha's hand slowed on the key. Not fear, not yet. Just the body registering data before the mind has assembled it into a conclusion. She pressed the door open. The smell arrived before the light adjusted. Copper, warm and insistent and unmistakable to anyone who has ever been close enough to violence to wear its atmosphere home in their clothes. And beneath it, threaded through it like a signature, something expensive, rain-soaked tobacco, and a cologne that cost more than her monthly rent, now ruined, now wrong in this room the way a cathedral painting would be wrong on a bus shelter wall. Trisha's hand found the light switch. The bulb caught. Her eyes swept the room the way they swept every room she entered, not with suspicion exactly, but with the particular vigilance of a woman who has learned that the cost of being unprepared is always extracted from her own body first. She swept from left to right. The small table. The two chairs, one of them hers, one of them Alyssa's, distinguished by the crayon marks on the leg of the smaller one. The window with its plastic sheeting taped against a draft she'd never fully defeated. The drawings on the wall, Alyssa's world rendered in primary colors, suns with faces, a house with a door that opened outward, a woman with a long coat and a girl with a stethoscope. Then the bed. The breath she pulled in did not make it all the way to her lungs. He was enormous. She had not expected that. The news cameras always flattened men to the scale of the screen. Removed the particular physical reality of a person who had been built by violence and maintained by it. But lying across Alyssa's faded quilt, his powerful frame consuming the narrow mattress from corner to corner, Park Kyubong was undeniably, overwhelmingly real. His suit, or what remained of it, was a crime scene rendered in silk and blood. The neck tattoos that Seoul's tabloids had spent years reproducing in ink sketches, beside words like brutal and untouchable, crawled up from his collar in the dim light, dark and alive-looking against the pallor that blood loss had pressed into his face. He looked like a man who had lost an argument with his own mortality and had not yet received the final verdict. He looked, against every instinct she had cultivated for 7 years of surviving this city, smaller than she'd expected. Trisha did not scream. This surprised her later. Not in a proud way, not in the way of a woman congratulating herself on composure, but with a kind of distant curiosity, the recognition that her body had made a calculation she hadn't consciously authorized. The scream had assembled itself at the base of her throat and then simply dissolved, as though it had checked the room for an audience and found the cost too high. Her eyes moved to the chair beside the bed. Alyssa was asleep in it, upright, her head tilted at the particular angle of a child who fell asleep mid-vigil and refused to lie down even unconsciously. Her plastic stethoscope was still looped around her neck. Her crayon-stained fingers were folded in her lap with a composure that made Trisha's chest perform a structural failure she felt physically, a crack running from sternum to somewhere deeper, somewhere she didn't have clinical language for. Her daughter had found the most feared man in Seoul bleeding in their corridor. And she had brought him inside and listened to his heart. Trisha crossed the room in 4 steps. She did not touch him. She crouched beside the bed and looked at the wound. A woman who had spent 2 years volunteering at a free clinic before Alyssa was born had a functional understanding of what a gut wound looked like and what it meant on a timeline. He had been bleeding for hours. The quilt was ruined. He was still breathing, which meant that either the wound was less catastrophic than it presented, or that his body was operating on a stubbornness she was prepared to believe was pathological. His face, up close, was etched with a pain he was unconscious enough to stop managing. The predatory architecture that stared from television screens, the hard jaw, the eyes described in news coverage as cold and calculating and without warmth, was still there in the bone structure, in the set of his mouth. But sleep and blood loss had removed whatever curating he did to it when he was conscious, and what remained underneath was something she had not expected. Something that had once been a person, before it became a reputation. Trisha sat back on her heels. The reward money was not an abstract number. She knew it precisely because she had heard it discussed 3 times at work tonight alone, passed between patrons, the way gossip moves through the gilded dragon, with appetite, with the excitement of people to whom money in those quantities is entertainment rather than salvation. Enough to leave this building. Enough to leave this district. Enough to put Alyssa in a school with actual textbooks and a roof that didn't conduct the rain directly into the classroom. Enough to stop performing invisibility as a survival strategy and simply, finally, be somewhere that didn't require it. One phone call. She looked at the man on her daughter's bed. She looked at her daughter in the chair beside it, the stethoscope rising and falling with her small, steady breaths. "Alyssa, what did you do?" It was not a question. It was the recognition, arriving slowly and then with total authority, that her daughter had made a decision tonight, a decision with the full weight of its consequences, carrying it without drama, carrying it the way Trisha herself carried the chair with the uneven leg, without nomming it, without requiring anyone to notice. The child had hidden a monster because the monster needed hiding. And somewhere in the architecture of that choice was something so purely and furiously good that Trisha felt the reward money dissolve in her mind the way the scream had dissolved in her throat. Not with virtue, not with noble resolution, with something rower than that, with the particular devastation of a mother who recognizes her own child doing something she herself no longer believed she was capable of. She pulled the thin blanket from the foot of Alyssa's chair and draped it over her daughter's shoulders without waking her. Then she sat down on the floor beside the bed, her back against the frame, her knees pulled up, and she looked at the door. The reward money had a number. I knew the number. I'd heard it 3 times that night across tables I'd refilled without being looked at. It was enough to make Alyssa's whole life different, and I sat on that floor and I watched the door and I did not reach for my phone. I'm still not entirely sure if that makes me brave or simply a woman who looked at her sleeping daughter and understood that some currencies cannot be spent without destroying the thing that earned them. She sat with it for a long time, the silence, the bass ghost in the ceiling, the slow and careful sound of Park Kyubong breathing through a wound that had no business allowing him to breathe at all. Occasionally she checked the corridor through the gap beneath the door. Shadow and stillness. Not yet. She knew it would not stay that way. Men like the one bleeding on her daughter's quilt did not disappear without generating a search. And the people doing the searching would not knock politely and wait to be invited in. They would come through doors the way doors were meant to be come through, with speed and decisiveness, and a total indifference to the lives arranged on the other side. She was still sitting on the floor when his breathing changed. A shift in the rhythm, shallower, faster, the body renegotiating something. His hand moved against the quilt, fingers spreading and then closing around the fabric the way a person grabs for something solid when solid things are becoming theoretical. His eyes opened. They were exactly what the news coverage had failed to prepare her for. Not cold, not calculating, just present and in tremendous pain, and for the duration of the 3 seconds before he had fully assembled where he was and what the parameters of his situation required, completely unguarded. He found her face in the dim light. She did not move, did not reach for her phone, did not arrange her expression into anything other than what it actually was, a woman who had made a decision she hadn't fully finished making, looking at the consequences of her daughter's mercy and trying to determine what came next. His voice, when it arrived, was barely architecture, gravel and effort, 2 words. The girl. Not who are you? Not where am I? Not the dozen self-preserving questions a man in his position should have prioritized. The girl. Trisha held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked at Alyssa, still asleep, still upright, the stethoscope catching the dim light, her small face arranged in the particular piece of a child who has done exactly what she intended to do and has no complicated feelings about it. She's fine, Trisha said, quiet, level. The voice of a woman who had learned that tone was sometimes the only wall between a room and what wanted to enter it. She's sleeping. He exhaled, long and deliberate, the exhale of a man releasing something he'd been holding since before he arrived here. His eyes closed again. Trisha looked back at the door. 3 feet of steel, and a bolt she already knew would not be enough. And somewhere above them, growing in the stairwell with the slow patience of something that had already decided the outcome, the sound of boots. The boots stopped outside their door. Not directly outside, that was the particular cruelty of it. They stopped one door up, at Old Man T's unit, and the silence that followed the stopping was the specific silence of professionals doing a methodical job. Not angry, not urgent. Methodical, the way a man runs a finger down a list. The way an accountant moves through a ledger, confirming each entry before advancing to the next. Trisha heard the knock on T's door and felt her spine become something architectural. Rigid, load-bearing, the kind of straight that has nothing to do with posture and everything to do with the body preparing itself for what the mind hasn't finished processing yet. On the bed, Kayubong's eyes were open. He had been awake for 11 minutes. She knew this because she had been counting, not deliberately. But in the way the body counts things when counting is the only available form of control. He had not spoken again after the 2 words. He had simply watched the ceiling with the focused stillness of a man running calculations, his jaw set against the pain, his hand pressed flat against the wound beneath the ruined shirt. His eyes had found the door the moment the boots entered the stairwell. They had not left it since. "How many?" he said, still barely architecture, but structured now, the question of a man who had filed away the pain somewhere interior and was operating from the part of himself that had kept him alive through 12 previous attempts. "I heard 2 sets on the stairs," Trisha said. She was still on the floor, her back against the bed frame, her voice so low it was almost texture rather than sound. "Could be more in the corridor." He absorbed this, nodded once, the nod of a man confirming data. In the chair beside the bed, Alyssa slept. The knock on T's door produced a muffled exchange. Trisha could not make out words, only tones. The visitor's tone was even, pleasant almost, the particular pleasantness of something very dangerous that has learned to front-load calm, because calm opens doors that force cannot. T's tone was brief, cooperative in the way of a man who has survived enough of the city to know which questions don't require deliberation. Then silence again. Then footsteps, resuming their position in the ledger. Moving down. Trisha felt Kayubong's hand find her shoulder from above, not grabbing, not urgent, just the brief weight of contact, and when she looked up at him, his eyes were communicating something that his voice couldn't risk amplifying. He tilted his head toward the far wall, toward Alyssa. "Wake her up." Every instinct Trisha possessed as a mother assembled itself into a single coherent objection. But beneath it, and arriving faster than she wanted to acknowledge, was the understanding that a sleeping child startled awake by a knock was a liability that none of them could afford. She rose from the floor in one silent motion, crossed to the chair, and placed her hand on Alyssa's arm. Alyssa's eyes opened immediately. Not with the groggy, blinking confusion of a child surfacing from deep sleep, with a completeness, a rapid, total return to full presence that Trisha had noticed before in her daughter and never quite found words for. As though Alyssa had not been fully asleep at all. As though some part of her had simply been waiting with her eyes closed, managing her rest the way you manage a resource you cannot afford to waste. She looked at her mother, then at the door, then at Kayubong. She did not make a sound. The knock came 3 seconds later. 3 raps, even, spaced with the patience of someone who was not operating on urgency, because urgency implied the possibility of failure, and this person had not budgeted for failure. The room held its breath. Kayubong's hand had found the edge of the mattress, pressing himself upright against the wall behind the bed, with a controlled, agonizing slowness that produced no sound and cost him considerably. She could see it in the locked set of his jaw, in the white at his knuckles. His other hand pressed the wound. His eyes were on the door with the flat, absolute focus of a man who has reduced the room to a tactical problem and is solving it in real time. Trisha was beside the door, not touching it, her hand at her side, her breathing managed to near nothing. Alyssa was standing in the center of the room. This was not where Trisha had left her. She had left her in the chair, but Alyssa had moved, silently and with complete intention, to the center of the room, and she was holding something. A sheet of paper, A4, slightly curled at the edges from being rolled and unrolled, covered in the dense and serious imagery of a child who draws not for pleasure but for documentation. Trisha recognized it. Alyssa had worked on it for 3 days the previous week, adding to it each evening with the focused deliberateness she brought to everything she considered important. She had called it, when Trisha asked, the monster map. A taxonomy of the things she had apparently decided needed to be recorded. Large, dark figures with sharp edges and angular bodies, rendered in heavy black crayon with red details that a child who had lived at the bottom of this building had absorbed from the ambient atmosphere of a life adjacent to the gilded dragon's overflow. Faces without softness, hands that were more like weapons than hands. It was, Trisha had thought at the time, an unsettling piece of work for a 7-year-old. She understood now that it had been preparation. The knock came again, 3 raps, identical spacing. Then a voice. Low, even, wearing the same pleasantness that had opened T's door, the pleasantness of something that has been trained to lead with its least threatening surface. Building management. Checking on residents. Open up, please. Alyssa looked at her mother. Trisha looked at her daughter. In the chair behind them, the plastic stethoscope lay where it had fallen. On the bed, Park Kayubong watched the door with eyes that had stopped calculating and moved into something beyond calculation. A stillness that Trisha understood, with a cold and absolute clarity, meant he believed the door would come in regardless of whether it was opened. Alyssa walked to the door. Trisha's hand shot out, caught nothing. Her daughter was already there, her small fingers on the bolt, and she looked back at her mother with an expression that stopped the room. Not a child asking permission, not a child seeking reassurance, but a child communicating a plan with the compressed efficiency of someone who does not have time for the full explanation and trusts that the demonstration will serve. She held up the drawing. Then she opened the door 4 inches. The bolt chain snapped taut. The man in the corridor was large. This was Trisha's first and most total impression, not his face, which was partially shadowed and partially constructed from the particular blank architecture of someone who has worn professional neutrality long enough that it has replaced whatever was there before. Not his suit, which was dark, and without the spectacle of violence even as it implied it absolutely. Just the fact of him, the space he occupied in the corridor, the way his presence made the 4-inch gap feel like an aperture. His eyes moved to Alyssa. Something shifted in them, not warmth, not hesitation exactly, but the minute recalibration of a man whose operational planning had not included this specific variable. A child at the door. A child at the door at this hour with this composure, looking up at him with wide and serious eyes and holding, in both hands, an A4 sheet of paper covered in black and red crayon. "My mom is sleeping," Alyssa said. Her voice was clear, the particular clarity of a child who has decided that clarity is her instrument and has committed to it fully. Not loud, not performing for a gallery, just present and direct and occupying the 4-inch gap with a certainty that was not bravado because bravado requires awareness of risk, and Alyssa Williams had bypassed risk entirely and gone straight to outcome. She held the drawing up, level with her face, facing outward. The man in the corridor looked at it. I've run the memory of that moment many times. A professional. A man built for rooms that end badly and compensated accordingly. Looking at a child's crayon drawing through a 4-inch gap in a basement door. I still don't have a complete explanation for what happened next. What I know is this. The drawings were of men. Large, angular men with sharp details and red on their hands. Men who looked, and I understood this only later, turning it over in the strange archaeology of that basement, like the men who had come to the building before. The overflow from the gilded dragon. The faces Alyssa had observed and recorded with the thoroughness of a child who pays attention to the things adults have decided she is too small to notice. She had drawn his world back at him, in crayon, with kitten bandages still on her fingertips from treating a patient who had no business being her patient. And he stood there. 4 seconds, 5. The man's eyes moved from the drawing to Alyssa's face. Back to the drawing. The pleasant professional surface remained in place, but beneath it, visible only in the specific way that things become visible when you are watching with the stillness of someone whose entire remaining future depends on accurate observation. Something was recalibrating. "Your mama home," he said. "She's sleeping," Alyssa said again. The same clarity, the same register. Not repeating herself out of nerves, but confirming a fact she had already established and saw no reason to escalate into additional information. "Anyone else in there with you?" Alyssa looked at him with her full, dark eyes, the eyes that had looked at Kayubong through the iron smell of his wound and seen a patient, and she said, with the absolute composure of someone who has decided that what she is about to say is simply true. "Just my drawings." The man in the corridor held the door's gaze for another 3 seconds. Then he stepped back. Not quickly, not with the quality of retreat, with the deliberate, unhurried movement of a man adjusting a conclusion, not abandoning it, not convinced, but filing this particular door under a category that would not serve his current operational priority. The pleasantness of his expression had not shifted. He had not been charmed. He had not been fooled in the way that word implies something simple. He had simply looked at a 7-year-old girl standing in a doorway at this hour of the night, with a drawing of monsters and the stillness of something ancient, and he had made a calculation that Trisha, pressed against the wall beside the door, her heart conducting itself in a way that she was certain was audible, did not fully understand. His footsteps moved down the corridor. Alyssa closed the door, re-engaged the bolt, turned around. She looked at her mother, then at Kayubong, then at the drawing in her hands with the brief, evaluating look of a craftsperson assessing a tool that has performed its function. She walked back to the chair, sat down, placed the drawing on her knees, face up. The corridor returned to silence. On the bed, Kayubong released a breath so controlled it was almost entirely interior. The kind of exhale that keeps itself quiet because the habit of quiet is now operating below the level of decision. His eyes moved from the door to Alyssa. They stayed there for a long time, with an expression that his face had clearly not been asked to produce in recent history, and was therefore assembling slowly, from components that had been in storage. Trisha found she could not look at it directly. It was too unguarded, too much like something being built in real time from materials that had almost expired. She looked at her daughter instead. "Alyssa," she said. Her voice had the quality of a structure that has been under load for an extended period and is only now, in the aftermath, registering the strain. "How did you know he would leave?" Alyssa considered the question with the thoroughness it deserved. "Because monsters," she said, with the matter-of-fact precision of a child explaining the self-evident, "don't like to see themselves." The corridor held its silence. And somewhere in the building above, the boots continued their ledger, advancing past their door, past their names, past the particular basement room where a man who had never been afraid of anything lay in the dark, trying to understand how a child with a crayon had just done what 12 assassins had failed to do. She had made him invisible. And the question that would sit in the silence long after the boots had gone, the question that Trisha turned over, that Kayubong would carry into whatever remained of his survival, was not whether the man in the corridor had believed Alyssa. It was whether he would come back when he did the math. Morning arrived in the basement the way it always did, not with light, but with sound. The building had a language that Trisha had spent 14 months learning to read. The pipes in the east wall spoke first, a low percussive knocking that meant the upper floors were running their taps, which meant it was somewhere between 6 and 6:30. Then the ceiling, a long, slow creak from the unit above as weight redistributed from bed to floor, which meant Old Man T was up, which confirmed the time with the reliability of a clock that had never once been wrong. Then the distant compression of the service elevator engaging, the particular hydraulic sigh of it, which meant the building was formally awake and the brief, suspended mercy of the night was over. Kayubong had not slept. Trisha knew this because she had not slept either, and in the hours between the boots leaving and the pipes beginning their testimony, the room had held the particular quality of two people maintaining a mutual and unspoken agreement to remain conscious. not communicating, not requiring anything of each other. Simply both being awake in the same space, managing the dark, listening to the building with the focused attention of people for whom the building's sounds had temporarily become the most important data available. The wound had slowed. She was certain of this in the pragmatic, non-clinical way of a woman who had watched it for hours and understood what the progression of a crisis looked like. It had not stopped, but it had entered a negotiation with his body that his body appeared, stubbornly and against considerable evidence, to be winning. She had used the last of the clean towels. Alyssa woke at 6:43 with the completeness she always woke with, eyes open, present, already somewhere in the middle of a thought that had apparently been running during sleep and simply resumed at volume. She looked at Kayubong first. Assessment. The stethoscope was around her neck before Trisha had fully registered that she'd picked it up. She pressed it to his chest. He looked at the ceiling during this process with an expression that Trisha was becoming familiar with, the expression of a man who has decided that the most dignified available response to his current circumstances is absolute stillness. He did not speak. He did not object. He simply held the ceiling in his gaze, while a 7-year-old conducted her morning rounds with the seriousness of someone whose medical opinion of the situation was the only one that mattered in this room. "Better," Alyssa said. The verdict of a physician who has reviewed the overnight data and found it satisfactory, if not conclusive. Kayubong said nothing, but something in the line of his jaw shifted, not quite the thing Trisha had glimpsed the night before, not the unguarded thing still being assembled from stored materials, but an acknowledgement. Small, structural, the equivalent, she thought, of a man nodding in a language he is only beginning to learn the grammar of. Alyssa replaced the stethoscope around her neck and moved to the small table in the corner that served as everything, desk, dining surface, the geography of their shared daily life rendered in 4 square feet of scarred wood. She arranged her crayons with the focused efficiency of someone beginning a workday. She had homework. She would do the homework. The fact that a bleeding man occupied her bed, and the building had been combed by professionals in the night, did not appear to have altered her sense of what the morning required of her. Trisha watched her daughter and felt the particular quality of love that has no adequate language, the kind that arrives as a physical sensation in the sternum, adjacent to pain. Then she opened the cupboard. The inventory was brief, because the inventory was always brief. 2 packets of instant ramen, which had been 3 packets yesterday. She had used one during the week's middle when the calculation had run particularly tight, and she'd told herself she'd replace it before it mattered. Half a bag of rice that was closer to a third of a bag if she was being precise, which she was, because precision in this context was not a personality trait but a survival requirement. A single egg, 4 tea bags. The bottle of soy sauce that was perhaps one serious meal away from empty. The kind of empty that announced itself with a hollow sound when you moved it, but continued to provide just enough to make the gesture of seasoning. Trisha looked at this for a moment. Then she took out 1 packet of ramen. She ran the water, put the pot on the small electric burner that had one functional setting, not high, not low, just the temperature it had decided on years ago and maintained with the stubbornness of something that has stopped accepting feedback. She broke the noodle block in half over the pot and watched it begin to separate in the water, the compressed brick slowly releasing into its component strands with the particular leisure of something that knows it has no reason to hurry. She felt him watching her. Not Alyssa. Alyssa was moving a yellow crayon across paper with the focused deliberateness of a child completing a sum. Kayubong. She could feel his attention from the bed the way you feel a change in air pressure, not intrusive, not demanding, just present. The eyes of a man who has spent decades reading rooms and cannot stop even when the room is a basement, and the transaction occurring is a woman deciding how to divide a single portion of instant noodles. She did not look at him. She knew what the cupboard contained. She knew what it did not contain. She knew the precise arithmetic of what was in front of her. And she performed it in the time it took the water to reach its lukewarm maximum. The one setting, the setting that was never quite enough but always, eventually, sufficient. When the ramen was ready, she poured it into the single bowl that Alyssa used. The one with the chipped rim that Trisha had never replaced because Alyssa had decided the chip gave it character and had drawn a small face on the chip in permanent marker so that it was now a feature rather than a flaw. She set it on the table beside the homework. She placed the spoon in it. 8, she said. Alyssa looked up from the sun, looked at the bowl, looked at her mother. You're not eating. I ate at work, Trisha said. She had not eaten at work. She had eaten half of a bread roll that a patron had left untouched and that the kitchen staff distributed among themselves in the way of people who have developed a dignified and wordless system for sharing the margins of other people's excess. Half a bread roll at 11:30. That was the inventory of her last 20 hours. You should eat with me, Alyssa said, the tone of a child who has not yet decided whether to accept the answer she has been given or to continue the interrogation. I had something big, Trisha said. I'm not hungry yet. Eat before it gets cold. It was not going to get cold. The one setting did not produce food capable of retaining heat with any ambition. But Alyssa picked up the spoon, and the interrogation suspended itself in the way that childhood interrogations sometimes do, not resolved, just filed somewhere for later retrieval. Trisha sat in her chair and watched her daughter eat. She kept her face arranged in the expression she had developed for exactly this, a specific configuration of features that communicated satisfaction, adequacy, the condition of a woman who has had enough and is now contentedly observing. She had worked on it. It was not a performance she was proud of. It was a performance she was good at, which was a different thing entirely, and the distinction mattered to her in ways she never articulated to anyone. She was very good at the hunger lie. I have given evidence in 3 languages about the nature of power. I have negotiated across tables where the wrong word ended careers, and sometimes more. I have read every human being who has ever sat across from me with the precision of a man whose survival depended on the accuracy of his reading. I watched Trisha Williams tell her daughter she wasn't hungry. And I want to tell you that I saw through it immediately. That the man who ruled Seoul's underworld spotted the lie inside the first second and cataloged it with the cold efficiency I cataloged everything. But the truth, the one I'm still not entirely comfortable with, is that I almost missed it. Because she was that good. Because she had practiced that particular lie until it had become indistinguishable from truth. And the only reason I caught it was because I knew what it cost. I have signed documents that moved enough money to feed this building for a decade. And I lay on a child's bed and watched a woman perform the hunger lie with professional precision and felt something in my chest that the bullet hadn't managed to reach. The billions in my accounts were sitting in servers in 3 countries, and I could not put food in a bowl. Kayubong said nothing for a long time. He watched Alyssa eat with the focused pleasure of a child who approaches ramen with genuine commitment. He watched Trisha watch Alyssa with the expression she had constructed. He looked at the cupboard, which Trisha had not fully closed, the door hanging open at the angle of something that has been opened and shut too many times to maintain conviction, and he saw what was on the shelves. He had grown up in a coastal town on nothing. He knew what almost empty looked like. He knew the specific geometry of a cupboard that has been managed with care and has reached the limit of what care can do. He looked at his hands. The rings were still on them. He had lost the jacket, lost the watch somewhere in the corridor or before it, but the rings remained. Heavy, architectural things. The kind of objects that exist to communicate a specific and unambiguous message about the person wearing them. The dragon's signet on his right hand alone contained enough gold to change the arithmetic of this room for a year. His hands were also, currently, largely useless. The left pressed against his wound. The right lacked the strength for anything requiring grip. He was a man in possession of significant resources and no capacity to access them, lying in a room where the gap between what was needed and what was available could be measured in a single packet of ramen. He looked at Trisha. She was still watching Alyssa with the constructed expression, but now, with the particular attention he was extending to her, he could see the edges of it, the places where the performance and the reality were not quite flush, the slight tension at the corner of her mouth. The way her eyes held a warmth for her daughter that was completely genuine and behind which, if you knew to look, the hunger was visible. Not dramatic, not collapsing. Just present, the way cold is present in a room without insulation. Quietly, consistently, without requiring acknowledgement to be real. He thought about the servers in 3 countries. He thought about the accounts that had been accruing interest through the entire night he'd spent bleeding on this bed. He thought about the specific helplessness of a billionaire who could not fill a bowl. Alyssa looked up from her homework, a spoon of noodles halfway to her mouth. She looked at Bong, then at the ramen, then at her mother, then back at the ramen with the focused deliberation of someone performing an internal calculation. She stood up. She carried the bowl to the bed. She held it out to him. "You should eat some," she said. "You lost blood. Blood needs food to come back." The medical logic was impeccable. The gesture was something beyond logic. Trisha was on her feet in an instant. "Alyssa, that's your..." "He needs it more," Alyssa said, the tone of a physician whose clinical judgment has been questioned and who is maintaining position. "I had breakfast yesterday, he didn't." Bong looked at the bowl, at Alyssa's face, at the bowl again. The dragon's signet caught the dim light of the single bulb. He had not said more than 6 words since regaining consciousness. The economy of his speech had not been strategic. It had been the genuine limitation of a man managing pain while allocating his remaining resources carefully. But now, he looked at this child holding out her food with the certainty of someone who has decided that the right thing and the obvious thing are the same thing, and something in the economy broke. "Your mother," he said, his voice still gravel and effort but deliberate. "Give it to your mother." Alyssa turned to look at Trisha. Trisha looked at Bong. He held her gaze with the flat directness of a man who has decided that the performance they are both maintaining has run its useful length. Not unkind, not demanding, simply accurate in the way of someone who has seen the hunger lie performed at close range and is declining to pretend otherwise. "I had something big," Trisha said, automatic, the reflex of a practiced thing. "No," Bong said, "you didn't." The room held the weight of it. Alyssa looked between them with the evaluating attention of a child watching 2 adults navigate a truth that has been in the room longer than either of them has acknowledged it. Then she carried the bowl back to the table. She took the spoon. She divided the remaining noodles with the seriousness of a surgeon, roughly half, as even as the bowl allowed, and she brought one portion back to the table in front of her mother's chair. She placed it down. She sat back in her own chair. She picked up her crayon. "Now we both eat," she said, the matter settled, court adjourned. Trisha sat down. She looked at the noodles in front of her. She looked at her daughter, already drawing again, the stethoscope swinging gently with the movement of her arm. She picked up the spoon. The sound she did not make, the sound of a woman arriving, after a long transit, at the specific threshold of being seen by the people she had been trying to protect from seeing her, was louder, in the quality of that room, than anything the building's pipes had produced all morning. Bong looked at the ceiling. The dragon's signet caught the light again, and this time he turned his hand over so that it faced the quilt instead. As though the weight of what it represented had shifted from asset to indictment, and he needed a moment before he could decide which one it was going to be. Somewhere above them, a door opened and closed. And in the corridor, just audible beneath the building's morning language, the sound of a phone ringing in the stairwell, 3 times, 4 times, then stopping. Not a resident's phone. The ringtone was wrong, too flat, too identical to the one she had heard twice the previous night. Trisha set her spoon down. Her eyes found Bong's across the room. He was already watching the door. The phone in the stairwell did not ring again. This was, Bong had explained in the low, economical language he'd adopted for communicating things that required her to understand without requiring extensive elaboration, worse than if it had. A phone that rang and was answered meant someone reporting in. A phone that rang and stopped meant someone who had found what they were looking for and no longer needed to communicate position. They had sat with this information for 40 minutes. Nothing came. Not boots, not knocking, not the particular quality of corridor silence that preceded the door coming in, just the building's ordinary morning, the pipes, the elevator, the distant percussion of a life being lived 2 floors up with no awareness of the geography beneath it. Eventually, even Kayubong's eyes had moved away from the door with the reluctant recalibration of a man adjusting his operational timeline. Not safe, not resolved, just not yet. The threat had a patience that matched his, and both of them had apparently decided to wait the other out. Trisha had gone to work. This had been its own negotiation, conducted in the whispered economy of a room that had learned to keep its communications minimal and close to the floor. She could not go. The rent was already 30 days into its grace period, a grace that the building manager extended not from kindness, but from the particular calculation of a man who knew that an empty unit in this district was harder to fill than a consistently late one. Missing a shift would not be recovered from. She had looked at Kayubong when she said this, not asking permission, not explaining herself, simply presenting the facts of her life with the directness of a woman who had stopped apologizing for the conditions of her survival. He had nodded, one nod, the nod that meant he had processed the information and filed it without judgment. She had looked at Alyssa. Alyssa had looked back at her with the expression that meant the conversation was unnecessary, because the conclusion had already been reached, and all that remained was for the adults to catch up. The door had closed behind Trisha at 7:52. And now it was just the 2 of them, the Iron King and his physician, in a basement room that smelled like laundry soap and crayons, with a building full of ordinary morning pressing down from above, and the particular silence of an arrangement that neither of them had language yet for navigating. Alyssa picked up her medical bag. It was not technically a medical bag. It was a canvas tote from a grocery store promotion, printed with a smiling avocado and the words fresh choices in a font that communicated optimism about produce. But Alyssa had designated it, and designation in her world carried the full weight of official classification. Inside it, the plastic stethoscope, which she wore but also stored here when not in active use. A small roll of bandaging tape that Trisha had bought for a sprained wrist, and which had been quietly requisitioned. A box of adhesive bandages printed with cartoon kittens in various poses, sitting, stretching, one inexplicably wearing a graduation cap, approximately 2/3 full. A plastic thermometer that no longer had batteries, but which Alyssa used for the taking of temperatures with the conviction that the instrument's integrity was independent of its power source. She set the bag on the edge of the bed and looked at him. "I need to check the wound," she said. Kayubong looked at her. "Properly," she added, in the tone of a physician clarifying the scope of a procedure to a patient who has displayed a pattern of underestimating its necessity. He had been managing the wound himself, his hand maintaining pressure with the automatic, practiced quality of a man who has needed to manage injuries in the field and has developed a system that operates below the level of conscious attention. He had not let Trisha near it beyond the initial assessment the first night. Not from pride, or not entirely, more from the particular stubbornness of a man whose survival had always been a private enterprise, whose body was the last territory he administered alone. Alyssa waited. She had, he was learning, an extraordinary capacity for waiting, not the fidgeting impatience of a child performing patience. Actual stillness, the kind that communicated that she had nowhere else to be and nothing more important than this, and was prepared to remain at this specific coordinate of time and space until the matter was concluded. He moved his hand. Alyssa worked with a focused quiet that reorganized the room's atmosphere. She had seen enough, apparently, to understand that the professional medical protocol for a wound of this nature was beyond her current resources, and she had made the practical adaptation of a person who operates with what is available rather than lamenting the absence of what isn't. She did not attempt the wound itself. Instead, she worked at its perimeter, the torn and bruised territory surrounding it, the places where the violence had expressed itself in damage that was serious without being immediately catastrophic. She cleaned what she could with water and the last of the clean cloth, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who understands that pressure and gentleness are not opposites but a collaboration. She did not narrate what she was doing. She did not ask him how he was feeling in the way that questions about feeling are sometimes deployed as performances of care rather than genuine inquiries. She simply worked, her small face arranged in concentration, the stethoscope swinging gently with her movements. Kayubong looked at the ceiling. The ceiling of this room had become a significant object in his life. He had spent more conscious hours examining it than he had spent examining anything in recent memory. The water stains in their irregular geography, the crack that ran from the northwest corner to approximately the center, and then stopped, as though it had made its point and saw no reason to continue. He had memorized it the way you memorize the face of something you are spending extended time with. The ceiling did not require anything from him. It was a neutral surface, and neutral surfaces had become, in this basement, a resource he did not take for granted. He felt the cold disc of the stethoscope press against his chest. "Breathe," Alyssa said. He breathed. She listened with her eyes closed, actually closed, in the manner of someone using one sense at full capacity and courteously reducing the load on the others. Her brow carried the slight furrow of active interpretation. Whatever she heard, she held it for a moment before opening her eyes and delivering the assessment with the composure of a clinician whose confidence in her methodology is not contingent on external validation. "Your heart sounds like it's arguing with itself," she said. He looked at her. "But it's still talking," she added. "That's good. I've had physicians. Good ones, men and women who charged fees that reflected the premium of being the person a man like me trusted with the information of his own body. They had instruments, degrees hanging in offices designed to communicate authority. They spoke in the language of clinical distance, which is the language of people who have learned that proximity to their patients' actual lives is professionally inconvenient. Not one of them told me my heart was arguing with itself. Not one of them made the arguing sound like evidence of something worth preserving. I have bought companies. I have funded the kind of violence that gets written up in police reports in language designed to make it sound impersonal. And I lay on a faded quilt while a 7-year-old pressed a plastic toy against my chest and told me my heart was still talking. I didn't have a single word for what that cost me to hear. The bandages came next. Alyssa opened the box with the reverence of someone accessing a significant resource and considered her inventory with appropriate gravity. The kittens on the bandage wrappers observed this process from their various poses: the sitting one, the stretching one, the inexplicable graduate. She selected 3, peeling them with care, and applied them to the peripheral damage with the precision of a person who has thought about placement. They were, objectively, too small. Each bandage covered perhaps a centimeter of the territory it was assigned to. The effect, aesthetically, was of someone attempting to address a structural problem in a building by applying decorative elements. Kayubong was aware of this. He looked down at the 3 cartoon kittens now adhered to his ribcage, and he was aware of it with complete clarity. He did not say so. Alyssa stepped back and assessed her work with the evaluating look of a craftsperson reviewing a completed phase. She made a small adjustment to the angle of one bandage, nodded. "You'll need real ones," she said, the acknowledgement of a professional whose tools have reached the boundary of their application. "But these hold the small parts together while the big parts decide." He looked at the bandages, at her. "Where did you learn that?" he said. It came out less like a question than an observation delivered in the form of a question, the phrasing of a man who was not sure what register to use for something he genuinely wanted to know. Alyssa considered this. "I decided I was going to be a doctor when I was 4, she said, with the matter-of-fact quality of someone reporting a fact that has long since passed from decision into simple truth. "So I've been practicing." "Practicing on who?" "Mostly my drawings." A pause. "You're my first real patient." The room sat with this. Kayubong looked at the ceiling again, and something happened in his face that the ceiling, being a neutral surface, received without comment. A movement in the jaw. A brief, involuntary thing that arrived and was managed with the speed of a man who had extensive practice in managing involuntary things, but not quite extensive enough for this particular one. He had been someone's first. Not in the way that word was used in his world, not the first target, not the first example made, not the first to receive the particular message that a king sends to establish the parameters of his kingdom. Someone's first patient, someone's inaugural act of a life's work, the first person a future doctor had tried to help. The arithmetic of it sat in his chest, alongside the arguing heart. Alyssa returned the instruments to the avocado bag with the systematic care of someone who takes the maintenance of their tools seriously. She recoiled the bandage tape. She replaced the thermometer. She looped the stethoscope around her neck, where it settled into its customary position with the ease of something that has been worn long enough to have a place. She picked up her crayons. Then she stopped. She turned back to him with the look of someone who has remembered an item on a list they were about to leave incomplete. "Does it hurt?" she asked. He had been asked this before, by the men who inflicted pain on his behalf, who asked it the way one confirms a result, clinically, without investment in the answer. By the physicians with their degrees and their professional distance, who asked it to calibrate medication and document complaint levels. He had always answered in the same register it was asked, functionally, without elaboration, treating pain as a metric rather than an experience. "Yes," he said. Not functionally, not as a metric. Just the word, stripped of the architecture he usually built around admissions, delivered into the room with the bare simplicity of something he had decided, in this specific moment, not to manage. Alyssa received it without drama. She did not offer sympathy in the way that sympathy is sometimes deployed as a performance of feeling. She simply nodded, the nod of a physician acknowledging a patient's report and incorporating it into the treatment picture. "Okay," she said, "I'll sit here then." She pulled her chair to the edge of the bed, not close enough to crowd him, close enough to be present, the precise distance, he thought, of someone who understood that company and intrusion were not the same thing and had calibrated accordingly. She opened her drawing pad. She selected a crayon. She drew. He watched the ceiling. The building moved through its morning above them, the ordinary sounds of lives being lived without awareness of the basement's particular suspended reality. The crack in the ceiling ran from northwest to center and stopped. The water stains held their irregular geography. The single bulb maintained its commitment to its one setting, neither more nor less than it had ever offered. After a while, Alyssa held up her drawing. It was him. Recognizably, the dark lines at the throat, the suggestion of a suit, the horizontal arrangement of a man on a bed. But in Alyssa's rendering, the tattoos were not dark and coiling and threatening. They were part of a pattern that she had apparently decided was decorative, almost deliberate, like the markings on something that had been made with intention rather than violence. And the face she had drawn, was not the face from the television screens, not the face that had emptied boardrooms and communicated the unambiguous message of a man who had constructed himself into something others feared. It was just a face, tired and present and belonging to a person. "I'm putting it on the wall," she said, "so you have somewhere to look besides the ceiling." She stood on the chair. She pressed the drawing to the wall beside the others, the sun's, the house with the outward opening door, the woman with the long coat. She smoothed its edges with her palm and stepped back to assess its placement with the eye of a curator who takes the arrangement of her collection seriously. Kaibong looked at it. At himself, as seen by the only person in Seoul who had looked at him, without deciding in advance what they were going to find. Something moved through him that he had no adequate language for, something that started in the chest where the kittens were, and traveled upward through the arguing heart, and arrived somewhere behind his eyes with the quality of a pressure that had been building for longer than the last 3 days. Longer, possibly, than he had the architecture to measure. He did not let it complete its transit. He was still working on that, on the permission for it. But it moved. Outside, in the corridor, something shifted in the quality of the silence. Not boots, Not the professional, grid-based patience of the men with the flat ringtones. Something different, a single set of footsteps, slow, with the particular uneven rhythm of age and a left knee that had never fully recovered from a dock injury 40 years prior. Old Man T. Stopping outside their door. Not knocking, just stopping. The way a man stops when he is deciding whether what he is about to do is wisdom or its opposite. Then a sound so quiet it was almost not a sound at all. Something being set down on the concrete floor of the corridor. Then the footsteps resuming, moving away, the uneven rhythm of them fatting back toward the stairwell. Alyssa looked at Kayubong. He looked at the door. The blood debt he had mentioned, the one Old Man T carried, the one Kayubong had never called in because calling it in had never served his interests, had apparently, in the economy of a basement room with cartoon kitten bandages on the wall and a drawing of a tired face beside the son's, decided to collect itself. Alyssa opened the door. On the concrete floor outside, a bowl covered with a plate, still warm, and beside it folded into a careful square a clean shirt. She brought them inside. She set the bowl on the table. She unfolded the shirt, assessed it, and looked at Kayubong with the eyes of a physician whose treatment plan has just received an unexpected resource. "See," she said, with the serene confidence of someone whose understanding of how the world works has just been confirmed by the world itself. The small parts hold together, and the big parts decide. In the stairwell above, a door closed. And somewhere in the city beyond the building's walls, a black SUV made a slow turn through the district and stopped at the corner, its engine idling with the patience of something that has made a decision and is simply waiting for the right moment to act on it. The shirt was 2 sizes too large and had the particular softness of something washed hundreds of times, not worn out, just arrived at the final version of itself, the version where the fabric has surrendered every pretension and become simply what it is. It smelled like the soap of an old man's careful life. Kayubong put it on with Alyssa's assistance, which she provided without being asked and without ceremony, holding the sleeve open at the right angle for an arm that could not yet complete the full arc of the motion unassisted. When it was done, she stepped back and assessed. He looked, objectively, like a man wearing a dead man's shirt 2 sizes too large over the ruins of his former life. The kitten bandages were visible above the open collar. The dragon's signet on his right hand caught the light. "Better," Alyssa said, the same word she had used for his heart that morning. Her standard of evaluation, apparently not perfect, not fixed, but oriented in the right direction. Better was enough. Better was the direction that mattered. She returned to her drawing pad. He ate the food T had left, a thick, simple soup with rice, the food of a man who had learned long ago what the body needed and had stopped requiring meals to be anything more than that. He ate slowly, with the controlled deliberateness of someone managing the relationship between hunger and a stomach that had been through significant events and was not prepared to be rushed. It was the first real food in 3 days. He did not identify what it cost him to accept it, not yet. The afternoon came in the way basement afternoons came, not with any change in light, because the light did not change here, the single bulb maintaining its one position on its one setting regardless of what the sun was doing in the world above. Time announced itself through other means. The building's sound shifted registers as the day moved toward its middle, less foot traffic on the stairs, fewer pipe communications, the particular settling quiet of a structure between its morning and evening activity. Alyssa had been drawing for 2 hours. She drew with the sustained focus of someone engaged in work she found genuinely interesting, occasionally holding a piece up to the light to assess it, occasionally making the small sound of a person revising an internal conclusion. The wall beside the bed had acquired 2 new additions since morning, a drawing of a bowl of soup with steam rendered in careful spirals, and a drawing of a hand with a ring on it, the ring given enough detail that it was clearly the dragon's signet, the dragon's scales suggested in small, patient marks. She had been drawing his things. Kayubong had observed this without comment, the way he observed most things in this room, with the full attention of someone who has stopped having anywhere else to direct it. He had been thinking about the SUV. It had not returned, as far as he could determine from the limited intelligence available to a man who could not leave his perimeter. But the thinking about it was unproductive in the specific way of problems you cannot yet act on. It consumed resources without generating output, and he had, over the course of the afternoon, made the pragmatic decision to close that file temporarily and direct his attention elsewhere. "Ask me something," he said. Alyssa looked up from her drawing pad. He was not, by disposition or practice, a man who invited questions. The invitation surprised him slightly as it left his mouth, the way a door surprises you when it opens inward instead of the direction you expected. But the room had a quality in the afternoon that made the silence feel less like an asset and more like something accumulating, and he found he had grown accustomed to the texture of her voice in a way that the silence was now, by contrast, making audible. Alyssa set down her crayon. She considered him with the evaluating attention she brought to significant decisions. "Where are you from?" she said. Not the question he had anticipated, though he could not have said what he had anticipated. Not anything tactical. Not anything about the men in the corridor or the woman who had been in his phone contacts under a name that now meant something entirely different than it had 72 hours ago. She had asked the question a child asks when they are interested in a person rather than a situation. The question that goes toward origin rather than circumstance, as though origin explains something that circumstance cannot reach. "Blasian," he said. Alyssa turned the word over. "Where's that?" "South Coast, 3 hours from here by train." A pause. 4 if you take the slow one." "Have you been on the slow one?" "Once." The memory arrived without announcement, the way memories do when you have not visited them in a long time and they have grown unfamiliar with being recalled. "When I was 9. There was no reason to take the slow one. I just wanted the extra hour." Alyssa looked at him. "Of what?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the building made one of its pipe sounds, the east wall, the one that spoke in the early morning. It spoke occasionally in the afternoon, too, when the pressure in the upper floors shifted. He had learned its vocabulary well enough to identify this one as inconsequential. "The window," he said. "There's a section of track outside Muryong where the train runs close to the water. The sea comes right up to the edge of the land. If the sun is at the right angle." He stopped. "What?" Alyssa said, not impatiently, with the quality of someone who has identified an unfinished sentence and is prepared to wait as long as required for its completion. "It looks like liquid gold," he said. "The whole surface of it, like the water is made of something heavier than water." Alyssa was very still. This was a different stillness from her professional stillness, from the stillness of assessment and diagnosis. This was the stillness of someone receiving something, taking it in carefully, making room for it. "I've never seen the sea," she said. The sentence arrived in the room with the particular weight of a simple fact that contains an entire life inside it. Not plaintive, not performed for sympathy, just accurate, delivered with the directness she brought to all accurate things. Kaobong looked at her. He thought about what it meant to be 7 years old in this building, in this district, with the city pressing from above and the sea 3 hours south, which might as well have been across a different kind of ocean, entirely given the arithmetic of what it cost to get there. He thought about a child who drew suns with faces and documented the world in crayon, because the world she had available to document was bounded by these walls, and so she had made the walls into a gallery and the gallery into a world. "It smells different first," he said. "Before you see it, the air changes. There's salt in it, it's not like anything else. You can't compare it to something else because there's nothing else it's like. You just know when you breathe it that you're close." Alyssa had picked up a crayon. Blue. She was not drawing yet, just holding it, the way a person holds something while they listen. "Then the sound," he continued, "even from a distance, a rhythm, like something breathing that is much larger than anything that breathes. Like a heartbeat. Like a heartbeat that doesn't know it has a name." She began to draw. Slowly, with more consideration than her usual focused efficiency, the crayon moving in long, deliberate strokes, building something horizontal across the page. My grandfather had a boat, Kayubong said. He had not thought about this in years. The memory had been filed somewhere in the interior geography that he did not regularly visit, not locked, just located in a part of himself that the last 2 decades of his life had made professionally irrelevant. Nothing significant, weathered wood and a motor that required negotiation every time you started it. He took me out before dawn sometimes. The water was black before sunrise. Not dark blue, not deep green black, the way ink is black with its own kind of shine. Were you scared? I was 9, he said. Everything was interesting before it became something to manage. Alyssa looked at him over the top of her drawing pad with an expression that contained, he thought, more understanding of that specific sentence than a 7-year-old should have been capable of assembling. But she had grown up at the bottom of a building that made people invisible, with a mother who performed the hunger lie with professional precision, and had apparently developed, through some process that was either precocity or the particular accelerated comprehension of a child who has had to read rooms since before she had language for what she was doing. A working understanding of what it meant when adults described what they had lost access to. Then the gold, he said. When the sun came up, it started at the horizon, just a line of it where the light met the water, and it spread. Slowly at first and then all at once, the way things change when they've been building toward it for a long time, the whole surface of it. He stopped. I have stood in rooms where power was transacted at levels most people spend their lives unaware of. I have been the reason for silences that lasted for years. I have built things that required entire systems of violence to maintain. I sat in a basement wearing a dead man's shirt and told a child about the sea. And the telling of it cost me something I wasn't prepared to spend, not because the memory was painful, but because it wasn't. Because it was the clearest and simplest thing I could find when I went looking, and what that said about the last 23 years was something I was not yet ready to finish understanding. She asked me if we would ever see it together. I am still working on what I said next. Alyssa held up her drawing. The sea, as rendered in blue crayon by a child who had never seen it, horizontal bands of blue in varying pressure, darker at the base, lighter toward a suggested horizon, and across the surface, in yellow, a series of overlapping marks that were unmistakably the attempt of someone trying to draw liquid gold without having a reference for liquid gold, working entirely from the description of a man on a faded quilt. She had gotten something true in it. Not accurate, she had no accuracy available to her, no visual memory to draw from. But something in the energy of the marks, in the generosity of the yellow across the blue surface, carried the quality of the thing he had described. The way a person who has never heard a particular piece of music can sometimes hum something adjacent to it if you describe it well enough. Is that right? She said. He looked at it for a long time. Yes, he said. She nodded, satisfied. She stood on the chair and pressed it to the wall between his portrait and the drawing of the bowl of soup. She stepped back and assessed its placement. When you're better, she said, still looking at the wall with the tone of someone stating a scheduling matter rather than articulating a hope, you should take us, me and Mama, on the slow train. The sentence occupied the room. Kayubong looked at the drawing on the wall, the blue bands and the yellow marks, the horizon that a child had invented from description alone and had gotten true without a reference. You should take the slow one, Alyssa continued, climbing back into her chair, retrieving her crayon. So there's extra time at the window. He looked at his hands, the dragon's signet on the right, the fatting ink along the knuckles. Hands that had done the accounting of his empire in the only currency he had believed in, for long enough that the belief had calcified into architecture, load-bearing, structural, not a position he held but a fact of what he was. He thought about the slow train. He thought about the extra hour. Alyssa, he said. She looked up. Your mother, he paused, finding the right coordinates for what he was trying to communicate. She works very hard. I know, Alyssa said, simply. The acknowledgement of a child who is aware of things she is not supposed to be aware of and has developed the grace not to make that awareness into a burden for the person it concerns. She deserves to see it too, he said. The gold. Alyssa looked at him with the full weight of those dark, serious eyes. That's why I said us, she said. Me and Mama. A pause, the precise length of a thought being completed. And you. The single bulb held its one setting above them. The building moved through its afternoon. Somewhere in the city above the district, the ordinary machinery of Seoul proceeded without awareness of or interest in the basement, where a man who had built a kingdom on the premise that fear was the only honest currency between human beings, was looking at a child's drawing of liquid gold and feeling the premise become less structural than it had been. Not gone, not resolved, just load-bearing less of the ceiling than it had yesterday. The shift was small, the shift was enormous. He looked at the wall. The sons with faces, the house with the outward opening door, the woman with the long coat and the girl with the stethoscope. His portrait, the tired face, the ink rendered decorative rather than threatening, the bowl of soup with its careful steam spirals, the dragon ring, its scales patient and small. And now the sea, the invented horizon, the yellow marks across the blue, the gold that a child had drawn from nothing but the words of a man who had been 9 years old on a slow train once and had never found a reason to go back. He would find a reason. This was not a decision he announced, even internally, with the formal weight of a resolution. It arrived with less ceremony than that, the way the tide arrives, not as an event but as a condition, the shore simply discovering that the water has come. He would find a reason to go back. He would take the slow train. And then the door at the top of the stairwell opened. Not the ordinary sound of a resident returning, not Trisha's step, which he had memorized by now, her particular rhythm on the stairs, the way her pace changed on the final flight when the weight of the shift had fully settled into her body. This was different in register and in number. More than one. Moving with the coordinated unhurry of people who have a destination and are not concerned about announcing their approach because announcement is, for them, beside the point. Alyssa's crayon stopped moving. Her eyes found his across the room. The drawing of the sea was still damp on the wall above her, the yellow marks not yet fully dry, catching the light in the way that wet crayon catches light, luminous and temporary and real. He was already reaching for the knife that wasn't there. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairwell, not continuing down, not retreating, simply stopping with the particular quality of a pause that is not indecision but positioning. The sound of people who have arrived at the outer boundary of their operational radius and are taking a moment to confirm the parameters before proceeding inward. Kayubong counted. 3 sets, maybe 4. The corridor acoustics in this building were imprecise. The concrete absorbed some frequencies and amplified others in a pattern he had not yet fully mapped, and in his current state, he was operating on perhaps 60% of the perceptual capacity he would have brought to this problem under better conditions. But 3 sets, minimum. Possibly a 4th positioned at the building's exterior, which he could not confirm from here, but which his understanding of how this particular operation would be structured suggested was likely. He looked at Alyssa. She was already looking at him. Not with fear. He had not once in 6 days seen fear on her face, and he had begun to understand this not as the absence of an appropriate response, but as the presence of something that had replaced it. Something older than fear in her, something that had grown in the particular soil of a life that had required her to develop resources the world had not budgeted for a child her age. She looked at him with the focused, receiving attention she brought to all situations that required assessment. "Under the bed," he said, low, the word shaped more than spoken. She moved without discussion, without the half-second of processing time most people required between instruction and action. She took the avocado bag. She took the drawing pad. She went under the bed with the swift, silent efficiency of someone who had thought about this contingency, which he understood, with a specific quality of feeling he did not have adequate language for, that she probably had. He was already moving. Moving was the generous word for it. What he was doing was a negotiation between his body's current inventory and the physical requirements of a man who needed to be upright and functional before the stairwell door opened again. He had been horizontal or semi-reclined for 6 days. The wound had stabilized, Alyssa's assessment, confirmed by the pragmatic evidence of him still being alive, and the bleeding having reduced to a level that his body was managing rather than losing. But stabilized was not the same as healed, and the distance between those two conditions announced itself with considerable clarity the moment he pressed his weight onto his feet. He stood. The room tilted, made its point, and then conceded. He found the wall, then the table, then the door frame, not to open it, but to have it, something structural to orient himself against while the room finished its recalibration and he took the full inventory of what he had available. Old man T's shirt, the kitten bandages beneath it, doing their patient, insufficient work. No weapon. He had made peace with this on day 2, when the search of every accessible surface had confirmed that this was a room that did not contain weapons, because it was a room that had never expected to need them. His hands. Whatever remained of the will that had kept him alive through 12 previous attempts, which he was counting on having enough residual authority to manage a 13th. And the ring. He looked at it, the dragon's signet on his right hand, gold, heavy, the scales rendered by a craftsman in Incheon who had worked on it for 6 weeks and charged accordingly. It had been on his finger for 19 years. He had put it on the morning he took control of the Gilded Dragon's upper syndicate, in a room full of men who understood that the ring was not jewelry but a transfer of power made material. It was a key, not metaphorically, not poetically, but in the specific and functional sense that there were accounts, safety deposits, and arrangements across 3 countries that would respond to its presentation by a living carrier, the way a lock responds to the correct key. In terms of what it could open, it was worth more than this building, more than this district, more than the arithmetic of Trisha's rent arrears and Alyssa's school, and the slow train to Blasian, and every version of a different life that Trisha had stopped letting herself calculate because the calculation had no available solution. He looked at it for a moment longer. Then he looked at the bed. "Alyssa," he said, barely above texture, "come out." A pause. Then she emerged, not with the dishevelment of a child who has been under a bed, but with her customary composure, the avocado bag over her shoulder, the drawing pad under her arm, the stethoscope in its position. She stood before him and waited. He crouched. The motion cost him. He brought himself to her eye level with the deliberate care of someone making a structural choice rather than a comfortable one, and he held his right hand out between them, the ring facing upward. "I need you to take this," he said. Alyssa looked at the ring. She studied it with the thoroughness she brought to all significant objects, not covetously, not with the particular brightness that the sight of gold produces in people who have been without it long enough, with assessment, the same look she gave a wound before deciding how to treat it. "What is it?" she said. "It opens things," he said. "Accounts, doors. It's if something happens to me and you give this to a man named Woo Sung-jin at the Hana Bank branch on Namdi Munro, he will know what it means. He will make sure your mother has," he stopped, reorganized. "It will change things for you and your mother, permanently." Alyssa looked at the ring, at his face, at the ring again. "How much is it worth?" she said. He told her. She received the number the way she received most things, without the performance of reaction, just the quiet incorporation of information into an existing picture. "That's enough to leave here," she said. "Yes." "And get Mama a different job." "Yes." "And for me to go to a school with," she paused, selecting the specific thing that mattered most from what was apparently a considered list. "A science lab." "Yes," he said, "all of that and more." Alyssa looked at the ring for a long time. Then she looked at him. "Why are you giving it to me now?" she said. The question carried more precision than its surface suggested. Not why me, she had apparently resolved that question to her own satisfaction by some internal process he had not been party to. Not what does it mean? She had already mapped the ring's function with the efficient comprehensiveness of a child who asks one question and retrieves the full answer rather than proceeding in installments. Specifically, why now? The timing. The stairwell. He held her gaze. He did not offer her the simplified version. She had not, in 6 days, demonstrated any tolerance for the simplified version of anything, and he had learned to respect this as a form of intelligence rather than attempt to manage it. "Because the men upstairs are looking for me," he said. "And if they find me, I want you to have something that means you never have to stay at the bottom of a building again. I have made transfers, signed instruments, moved assets across jurisdictions with the efficiency of a man who understands that wealth is most powerful when it is most mobile. I have given men things that changed their lives, for the better and for otherwise. I have never before crouched on a concrete floor with a wound held together by cartoon kittens and offered everything I owned to a 7-year-old. And I have never before had someone refuse it." Alyssa reached out. For a moment he thought she was going to take it, her small fingers extended toward his hand, and he felt the weight of the transfer about to happen, the 19 years of the ring's particular gravity preparing to shift. She folded his fingers over it instead. Not quickly, with care, the same care she brought to wound management, to bandage placement, to the deliberate and considered way she did everything that mattered. She pressed his hand closed around the ring with both of hers and held it there for a moment, the way you hold something you want to make sure is properly secured. Then she let go. He looked at his closed fist. "Alyssa, you'll need it," she said, "to get back." "Get back where?" She looked at him with the full weight of those eyes, the eyes that had looked at him through the iron smell of his wound on the first night and seen, apparently, something worth the trouble of hiding. "Busan," she said, "on the slow train, you said there was extra time at the window." The corridor above was no longer silent. The footsteps had resumed, descending now, measured and unhurried, the sound of a clock running down to something that had been scheduled in advance and was proceeding on time. "You keep it," he said. "If I come back, you can give it to me then." "And if you don't?" He looked at her. At the wall behind her, the sons, the house, the woman with the long coat, his tired portrait, the bowl of soup, the drawing of the ring itself in crayon and the sea. The invented horizon. The yellow marks across the blue that she had gotten true without a reference. "Then you take it to Woo Sung-jin," he said, "and you become a doctor, a real one, with actual instruments." Alyssa considered this with the seriousness of someone reviewing the terms of a significant agreement. Then she turned and opened the avocado bag. She removed the drawing pad and found a clean page. She worked quickly, not with her usual deliberate pace, but with the speed of someone who has assessed the available time and adjusted accordingly. 30 seconds. 40. She tore the page out and held it up. It was him again. Not the tired portrait on the wall, this one was different. Standing. Upright, the suit replaced by something less specific, a shape that suggested a person in motion rather than a person enduring. The ink at his throat still present, but in her rendering carrying the quality it always carried in her drawings, patterned, deliberate, belonging to him rather than marking him. And beside the figure, small but clearly present, a child with a stethoscope. On the train. The window behind them, rendered in the same yellow she had used for the sea, the light coming through it, the horizon visible beyond. At the bottom of the page, in the large and careful letters of a child who has learned to write and takes the written word seriously. "Come back." She folded it. She pressed it into his hand alongside the ring. "That's worth more than the ring," she said, "so you have to bring it back when you return it." The stairwell door opened. The sound of it, heavy steel, the cousin of their own door's surrender, moved through the building's acoustics with a clarity that ended the space for anything that was not immediate. 3 sets of footsteps on the stairs, and now he could hear them without the corridor's interference, without the absorbing properties of concrete between. Professionals. Descending with the coordinated pace of people who have agreed, without needing to discuss it, on the speed that communicates control without urgency. Kayubong closed his hand around the drawing and the ring. He looked at Alyssa. She looked back at him with the expression she had worn on the first night, the expression that had stopped him in the doorway, that had reached past 23 years of survival architecture and done something he still didn't have the full language for. The expression of a child who had looked at a bleeding monster and seen a patient and had never once revised the diagnosis. "Under the bed," he said. "Don't come out until your mother's voice, only hers, do you understand?" "Yes," she said. She did not move immediately. She stood before him for one more second, and then she did something she had not done before, something that arrived without announcement and without the careful deliberation she brought to all her significant actions. She stepped forward and pressed her face briefly against his arm. Not a hug, she was too precise for gestures that weren't exactly what they meant. Just contact, brief and complete. Then she went under the bed. The avocado bag, the drawing pad, the stethoscope settled into silence. Bang turned to face the door. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. He looked at his closed fist, the ring, the folded page. He opened his hand. He looked at the drawing one more time, the window light, the invented horizon, the two figures on the slow train. "Come back." He placed the folded page beneath the mattress edge, where Alyssa could reach it. The ring he put back on his finger. Not for what it communicated to the men about to come through that door, though it communicated something, and he was not above using every available instrument. He put it back because she had told him he would need it to get back, and he had decided, in the space between her folding his fingers over it and the footsteps reaching the bottom of the stairs, that she was right. She had not yet been wrong about anything. 3 knocks on the door, even, spaced with a patience that had stopped pretending to be anything other than what it was. Bang, the Iron King of Seoul's underworld, the man the city had spent 2 decades fearing, currently standing in borrowed clothes with cartoon kittens on his ribcage and a crayon drawing of a slow train under the mattress behind him, straightened to his full height. He pressed his palm flat against the door. And for the first time in 6 days, he spoke at full volume. "I know who sent you," he said. His voice arrived in the corridor the way it was designed to, with the total authority of a man who has never once needed to raise it to be heard. "Tell him the Iron King is standing, and tell him what that means." Silence from the corridor. Then, after a beat that contained something he recognized as recalibration, a voice, young, controlled, wearing a professional surface over something that was not, quite, as certain as it was trying to present. "Sir," the voice said, "he says to tell you he expected you to be dead by now." Bang looked at the mattress, at the edge of folded paper just visible beneath it. "Tell him," he said, "that a doctor disagreed." The corridor held the silence for 11 seconds. Bang counted them against his palm, still flat on the door, feeling the steel's cold communicate itself up through his hand and into the arm that was managing the weight of his posture with the focused determination of a structure that knows it is being load-tested and has decided not to yield on principle. 11 seconds was a long time in an operational context. It meant the voice on the other side had a chain of communication to manage, a report to make, an instruction to receive, a decision being made by someone who was not present and whose absence from the door meant he was either directing from a position of strategic remove or had not yet committed to the version of this that ended with the door coming in. The lead enforcer. Bang had not let himself think the name directly until now. He had managed it at the perimeter of his thinking, acknowledging its shape without looking at it full on, the way you manage a source of heat by being aware of its position without standing in it. But 11 seconds meant a chain, and a chain meant a command structure still intact, and a command structure meant the man at the top of it was close enough to be directing in real time. He was in the building, possibly the floor above, possibly outside in the black SUV that Bang had heard depart and return twice in the last 24 hours, its engine carrying the particular idol of a vehicle that had committed to patience as a tactic. Possibly in the stairwell itself, having sent the voice ahead as a first instrument while he positioned himself as the second. The 11 seconds ended. "Sir," the voice said. He says your authority expired when the Gilded Dragons Board ratified the transition. He says what you were is a historical fact. Caillou Bong was quiet for a moment. Tell him, he said, that history has a way of revising itself. The silence that followed was shorter. 4 seconds. The communication happening faster now, the chain tightening, the distance between instruction and execution collapsing. Then the door came in. Not the bolt, the frame itself, the steel edge of it separating from the concrete, surround with the sound of something that had been holding on finally releasing its position. The door hit the interior wall, and the single bulb swung on its fixture, sending the room's shadows into a brief, lurching rotation before settling back into the ordinary geography of the space. 2 men through the threshold in under 2 seconds. Trained, coordinated, the kind of entry that gets practiced until it becomes reflex, so that the moment of breach contains no decision-making, only execution. They were in dark clothing, professional in the way of people who have resolved the question of what they are and have stopped requiring it to look like anything in particular. Caillou Bong was not at the door when it came in. He was at the far wall, the wall with the drawings, with the suns and the sea and the tired portrait and the 2 figures on the slow train. He had moved there in the 11 seconds, not quickly, not with the fluid economy he would have brought to this problem under better conditions, but with enough deliberateness that he was upright and facing the door when the men entered, and the room's geometry was therefore not what they had anticipated. They adjusted. They were good enough to adjust quickly. The first man cleared the room with his eyes in under a second. Bed, table, walls, the gap between bed and floor from which no immediate threat was visible. The second took the door side. They communicated without communicating, the silent grammar of people who have spent enough time operating together that the language has gone below the level of gesture. 3 seconds, 4. Neither of them had yet registered what was behind them. Trisha Williams had come in through the service entrance. This was not a plan she had constructed in advance. Plans require the luxury of anticipation, and the last 6 days had not offered that particular luxury in any sustainable quantity. What she had was the accumulated intelligence of 14 months in this building. 14 months of learning its architecture, the way you learn the body of something you live inside, not from study, but from daily navigation, from the particular knowledge that accumulates in a person's hands and feet before it reaches their head. She knew the service entrance because she used it on late shifts when the main door's lock was being managed by the building's particular maintenance philosophy, which was to acknowledge problems without urgency. She knew the electrical panel on the service corridor wall because she had stood in front of it 3 times while waiting for the building manager to reset the power after outages. And she had the specific memory of a woman who files the details of systems that affect her life, because those details might someday matter. She had come up the service stairs. She had heard the door come in from the landing above. She had not gone toward it. She had gone to the panel. The service corridor's electrical panel served the basement units, and a portion of the ground floor through a wiring layout that the building's original architect had designed, and the building's subsequent maintenance history had modified in ways that were not reflected in any documentation, and that Trisha understood from the specific evidence of which switches affected which lights in her unit when she tested them after the 3rd outage. She pulled 3 wires. The darkness was complete. Not the managed dark of a room with curtains, the total, structural dark of a space with no light source active and no ambient input from outside, the basement's position below street level removing even the theoretical contribution of exterior lighting. The kind of dark where the eyes perform their urgent recalibration and find no data available for the recalibration to work with. For the 2 men in the room, who had entered with their operational picture already established and were now functioning in its sudden and total absence, the darkness was a problem that required immediate management. They had their training for this. It included, Caillou Bong knew, protocols for sensory deprivation environments. Stand ground, establish audio bearings, communicate position. They would implement these protocols in under 3 seconds, because they were professional enough to have the protocols and disciplined enough to execute them under pressure. 3 seconds was more than enough. Caillebotte knew this room. He had spent 6 days in it with the particular comprehensive attention of a man who has nothing else to do, and for whom attention has always been a survival resource. He knew the distance from the far wall to the table in steps, and in the specific quality of the floor's surface underfoot, the place where the concrete had a seam, the place where the rug's edge created a transition he had mapped with his feet during the night hours when he had been mobile enough to need the bathroom and careful enough to manage the journey without sound. He knew the table's height and position relative to his body. He knew the bed frame's geometry. He knew the exact location of the door. He did not need the light. They did. He moved. This is the part I don't narrate in detail. Not because I'm not willing to own it. I own everything I've done in this life with both hands, the empire built on fear, the years of violence administered as policy, the rooms that ended badly because I decided they would. I own all of it. What happened in that room in the dark, I own also. But Alyssa was under the bed. And there are things I will not perform for an audience when she is close enough to hear them. The man who fought in that room was not someone I am in the process of becoming. He was someone I was, wholly and completely, without apology, because apology requires distance, and there was no distance available. What I will tell you is this: the dark was mine. It has always been mine. I was raised at the bottom of things, and the bottom of things teaches you that darkness is not the absence of something. It is a presence. It has weight and temperature and direction, and the people who have lived in it longest navigate it better than the people who are merely visiting. They were visiting. I was home. The sounds in the dark were not things Trisha could interpret with precision. She was in the service corridor with her back against the wall beside the panel, her hands still on the pulled wires, her breathing reduced to the minimum that biology would permit. She had learned in 6 days what the silence of the room sounded like when it was inhabited by people managing their presence carefully, and she understood that what she was hearing now was a different category of sound entirely. Brief, close, purposeful, with the quality of things being decided rather than things being observed. She did not go in. This was the hardest thing. Not the wires. Pulling the wires had been a decision that arrived and was executed in the same breath. The kind of clarity that extreme circumstances sometimes produce in people who have been preparing for extreme circumstances without knowing that's what they were doing. The hardest thing was the door. The open door, the dark beyond it, and the sounds that she was parsing with the focused desperation of a mother trying to determine from audio alone whether her child was breathing. Then, Mama. One word, from the floor level. Alyssa's voice, quiet, controlled, carrying the particular composure of a child who has been told to stay under the bed until a specific voice is heard, and who is now reporting to that voice with the reliability of someone who follows instructions precisely, because she understood why they were given. Trisha was through the door. She did not reach for the light. She went to the floor beside the bed in the dark, navigating the room's geography by the same accumulated knowledge that had taken her to the panel, 14 months of living in a space until you know it below the level of sight. Her hands found the edge of the bed, found the floor beneath it, found Alyssa. Alyssa came out with the avocado bag and the drawing pad and the stethoscope, and she pressed herself against her mother's side with the brief, total quality of contact that communicated relief without requiring either of them to name it. 1 second. 2. Then Alyssa pulled back and turned toward the room. Caillebotte, she said, the same quiet, clear register, reporting, checking. Silence from the room for a moment that Trisha felt in her sternum. Then a sound of weight redistributing, something finding the wall, the particular quality of a man who has spent what he had and is now taking the inventory of what remains. Here, his voice, gravel and effort, the same register it had always been, but carrying something that the previous 6 days' worth of that voice had not contained. Not pain, exactly, though the pain was present. Something more like the sound of a person who has come through the far side of something and is in the process of determining what they are on the other side of it. Trisha reached for the panel in the service corridor without leaving the room, the wiring accessible from the doorway if you knew the angle. She reconnected one circuit, not all of them, just enough. The single bulb caught. The room was changed. She had known, in the abstract, what the room would look like after. The abstract had not prepared her for the specific. She took it in with the focused pragmatism of a woman who had learned that some things needed to be processed in motion rather than in stillness. Her eyes moving, her hands already finding what needed to be found, her mind sorting what was immediate from what was significant from what would need to be carried differently in the future. There were two men on the floor. She did not examine them beyond the confirmation of breathing, present, regular, the sleep of people who had been removed from a situation rather than from the world. They would wake. They would report. Whatever was in the stairwell, whatever was idling in the black SUV outside, would receive a version of this room that Kayubong had authored in the dark, and it would have to decide what that version meant. Kayubong was against the far wall. Upright, she noted this with the particular quality of relief that arrives as a physical sensation, a release of something held, but using the wall with the honest dependence of a man who has been clear-eyed about his resources and has expended the majority of them. The borrowed shirt had lost its last argument with the evening's events. The kitten bandages were doing their patient, insufficient work against a wound that had asked more of itself than it had available. He was looking at the wall. At the drawings. Alyssa moved across the room to him before Trisha could frame a sentence. She pressed the stethoscope to his chest with the efficient purposefulness of a physician conducting an urgent assessment, her face arranged in the focused concentration of a clinician who requires data before she can determine the next step. She listened. Then she looked up at him with the expression of someone whose diagnosis has been delivered by the instrument and confirmed by her own judgment. Still arguing, she said. Kayubong looked down at her. Something moved through his face that he did not manage, did not redirect, did not file somewhere interior to be processed privately. It arrived and it stayed raw and structural and belonging to him completely. Still talking, he said. Still talking, she confirmed. Trisha stood in the center of the room and looked at the two of them, the tattooed king against the wall of her daughter's drawings, and her daughter with the plastic stethoscope, and the absolute composure of someone who had always known this was how the story went, had been moving toward this moment with the focused intention of a person who understood that some patients required more than instruments to heal. From the stairwell above, a door opened. One set of footsteps, descending alone, unhurried in the way of someone who has decided that hurry is beneath the gravity of what they are about to do, that the correct pace for this particular descent is the pace of a man arriving at a conclusion he has been moving toward for a long time and has stopped pretending he is not going to reach. The lead enforcer. Not sending instruments ahead this time. Coming himself. Kayubong pushed off the wall. He stood without it, briefly, with the full cost of that visible in the set of his jaw and the controlled quality of his breathing, and he looked at Trisha. The panel, he said. Can you do it again? Trisha looked at the doorway, at the service corridor beyond, at the wiring she had already pulled once tonight, in the dark, with her hands on a system she understood because she had paid attention to the things that affected her life. Yes, she said. Not yet, he said, when I tell you. She looked at him, at her daughter, at the drawings on the wall behind them both, the sea, the horizon, the two figures on the slow train. When you tell me, she said. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. And in the suffocating silence of the basement, the room held its breath, the woman at the panel, the child with the stethoscope, and the man who had fought in the dark for something he had no previous experience of protecting, standing at the full height of what he was, waiting for the door. The footsteps stopped outside the door. One set. The lead enforcer did not announce himself through intermediaries this time. He had sent his instruments ahead and received their report in whatever form the dark had delivered it, and he had descended alone with the particular quality of a man who has decided that the matter requires his direct attention. Not because the instruments had failed, exactly, because what they had encountered had revised the operational picture sufficiently that he needed to see it himself. Kayubong knew this about him. He had trained him in this, in the specific value of direct assessment when secondary reporting contained anomalies that the reporting structure could not fully account for. He had spent 4 years making the lead enforcer into the instrument he currently was, had taken a young man with raw violence and structural intelligence, and given him the architecture to direct both with precision. He had built him in the specific way that men in his position build successors, not with affection, because affection was not a currency he had traded in, but with the comprehensive investment of someone who understood that the quality of what came after him reflected the quality of what he had been. He had not anticipated being the thing that came after. The door opened. Not kicked in this time. Pushed with the controlled, unhurried pressure of a man who does not need to force his way into rooms because rooms have always opened for him, and who understands that the manner of entry communicates something about the person entering that a forced breach cannot. The lead enforcer filled the threshold. He was, objectively, an impressive construction. Kayubong had always known this, had tracked it, in fact, across the 4 years of his development with the evaluating attention of a craftsman monitoring the progress of significant work. The tailored black suit, the scarred face that he had stopped trying to conceal somewhere in his 3rd year, because the concealment had started to look like apology, and apology was incompatible with what he was becoming. The physical scale of him, which Kayubong had watched consolidate from the raw material of a young man's aggression into the settled, structural authority of someone who had learned that size was most effective when it was still. He was still now. His eyes moved through the room with the trained efficiency of a man cataloging variables. The two on the floor, the woman at the doorframe to the service corridor, the child in the center of the room with a plastic stethoscope around her neck, and finally, at the far wall, Kayubong. They stayed there. Something moved through the lead enforcer's face that did not make it all the way to expression. A compression, the particular internal event of a man whose operational picture has been revised again, and who is managing the revision with the discipline of someone who cannot afford to let it become legible. "You look terrible," he said. "You should see the other two," Kayubong said. The lead enforcer stepped fully into the room. He did not look at the drawings on the wall. He did not look at the kitten bandages or the avocado bag or the faded quilt with its map of the last 8 days rendered in evidence. His eyes remained on Kayubong with the focused, absolute quality of a man for whom the room contained exactly one relevant variable, and he was looking at it. "The board ratified the transition 46 hours after you disappeared," he said, the tone of a man delivering a factual briefing. Neutral, precise, stripped of the editorializing that personal investment would have produced, which was itself the editorial, Kayubong understood. The performance of neutrality by someone for whom neutrality was not natural was its own form of communication. "The Gilded Dragon is operating. The district is under management. What you built is intact." "What I built," Kayubong said. "What we built," the lead enforcer said, a fractional adjustment, the first one. "What I finished building after you were no longer in a condition to." "I was in a condition," Kayubong said. "Someone changed the condition." The room held this for a moment. "You were going to negotiate with the Blasian faction," the lead enforcer said. Not a question. The tone of a man stating the premise of an argument he has been having internally for longer than tonight. "You were going to give them the southern routes in exchange for a peace that would have cost us more than the war would have. I ran the numbers. I ran them 4 times. The negotiation was going to hollow the empire from the inside over 18 months, and you were going to let it happen because you were tired." The last word landed differently from the others. Tired. He had not said weak. He had not said failing. He had chosen tired with the precision of someone who understood the word's specific weight, its accusation and its accuracy both held inside it. Kayubong looked at him. "You were right," he said. The lead enforcer held very still. "I was tired," Kayubong said. "I had been tired for a long time. You were right about the negotiation, and you were right about what it would have cost, And you were right that I was no longer making decisions from the place that built the empire. You were right about all of it." He let that sit. "And you still sent men to put a bullet in me." Something shifted in the lead enforcer's face. The compression deepening, the internal event becoming larger, requiring more management. Kayubong had spent 4 years learning to read this face, and what he was reading now was not the operational neutrality that the man had walked in wearing. Beneath it, doing the structural work that the neutrality was designed to conceal, was something that the lead enforcer had apparently not fully anticipated needing to manage in this specific room. Pain. Not remorse in the abstract policy sense, the actual, specific pain of a man who has done something to someone he could not name the full nature of his relationship with, and who has been carrying the unnameable thing since before the bullet was authorized. "I needed it to be clean," the lead enforcer said, the first sentence he had delivered without the quality of a briefing, raw at its edges. "If you had simply stepped back, if you had given the word to transition, the factions would have read it as abdication. They would have moved on the Eastern Territory within the month. Everything would have come apart." A pause. "I needed the king to fall, not retire. I needed the story to be the right story for what came after." "And now," Kayubong said. The lead enforcer looked at him. At the borrowed shirt, the kitten bandages visible above the collar, the dragon's signet on the right hand, the full and frank evidence of 8 days in a basement at the bottom of a building he would never have previously acknowledged the existence of. He looked at all of it with the comprehensive attention of a man conducting an assessment he had not expected to be conducting. "Now the story is complicated," he said. "Good," Kayubong said. "Simple stories are for men who haven't been paying attention. This is the moment. I have run more times than I can account for." He came in to finish it. I knew this, not as a fear, not as an assumption, but as the operational read of a man who trained the person across from him and understands his methodology. He came in because the instruments had sent back a report that required direct assessment, and direct assessment in this context had only one available resolution. But he was also a young man who had walked into my office at 22 years old with raw intelligence and nowhere to put it, and whom I had spent 4 years turning into something I believed in. Not loved. I had not used that word in 20 years, and I was not going to reconstruct it in a basement at my own dissolution. But believed in. The way you believe in something you made with your full attention. He came to finish it. What he found was a man in a borrowed shirt with cartoon kittens on his ribcage, standing in front of a wall covered in a child's drawings, and declining to move. "I want to tell you the decision I made was strategic, that I assessed the variables and calculated the most effective approach, that the Iron King performed, in those next 60 seconds, the most sophisticated negotiation of his career. The truth is simpler and harder than that. I was standing in front of Alyssa's wall, and I had decided, with a completeness I had not previously experienced on any question, that I was not moving." The lead enforcer's eyes went to Alyssa. She was standing in the center of the room where she had been standing since the door opened, not behind Kayubong, not pressed against the wall, not positioned in any of the places a frightened child positions themselves when danger enters a room. Standing in the center of it, the stethoscope around her neck, the avocado bag over her shoulder, looking at the lead enforcer with the full, dark, receiving attention she brought to all significant things. She was studying him. Not with fear, with the focused diagnostic interest of a child who has decided she is gathering information about something she has not encountered before and intends to reach her own conclusion about. The lead enforcer looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at Kayubong. "Who is she?" he said. "My doctor," Kayubong said. The silence that followed this had a different quality from the silences that had preceded it. The operational silences, the ones measuring distance, calculating angles, managing the timing of decisions that had been made in advance of the room. This one was different. This one contained genuine uncertainty. The lead enforcer, who had built his authority on the elimination of uncertainty from his operational picture, stood in a basement room and experienced. Kayubong could see it. The the particular disorientation of a variable he had no category for. "She hid me," Kayubong said. "8 days ago I came through that door with a bullet in my side, expecting the floor to be the end of it. She put me in the bed. She treated the wound. She turned away your men with a crayon drawing." He paused. "She told me my heart was still talking." The lead enforcer said nothing. "I have spent 23 years, Kayubong said, "building a kingdom on the principle that fear was the only honest currency between human beings, that people were either instruments or obstacles, that the only reliable architecture was the kind that made others smaller." He looked at the wall, at the suns, the sea, the tired portrait, the slow train. "A 7-year-old girl with a plastic stethoscope has spent 8 days demonstrating that I was wrong about every single item on that list." He turned back to the lead enforcer. "You want to know what the story should be," he said. "For what comes after, for the factions, for the board, for the version of events that holds the Empire's walls up." He took one step forward, the full cost of it visible, the wound making its accounting audible in the quality of his breathing, his body's honest report of its own condition delivered without his permission. "Here is the story. The Iron King went into the dark. What came out of the dark is something the factions have not encountered before and do not have a category for. That story is more useful to you than a clean death. A king who cannot be killed by his own best instrument is a different kind of king than the one you put the bullet in." The lead enforcer was very still. "And if I disagree," he said. Kayubong looked at him. Then he did something he had not done in the 4 years of the man's development, in the full span of their operational relationship, in any of the rooms they had shared across the architecture of the empire they had built together. He told him the truth, without the management layer. "Then you will have to come through me," he said, "and I want you to understand what that means, not as a tactical assessment, not as a negotiation position." His eyes moved briefly to Alyssa, 1 second, the look of a man confirming the location of the thing that has reorganized his entire operational picture, and then back. "If you come through me, you come through the first person in 23 years who looked at what I am and decided it was worth the trouble of saving. And I have discovered, in the last 8 days, that I am no longer capable of allowing that." The room was completely still. Alyssa walked forward. She stopped in front of the lead enforcer and looked up at him with the full weight of her diagnostic attention, the stethoscope swinging gently with the movement of her stopped body. She studied his face with the focused, receiving quality she brought to all significant assessments. "You're the one who hurt him," she said, "not an accusation, a clinical finding." The lead enforcer looked down at her. Something happened in his face. The professional surface, the constructed neutrality, the operational architecture of a man who had decided what he was and had stopped requiring it to look like anything other than what it was, it moved. Fractionally. The way stone moves when water has been working on it long enough that one morning there is a crack where yesterday there was none. "Yes," he said, the first word he had delivered in this room without the quality of management. Alyssa considered this for a moment with the seriousness of a physician, incorporating a significant piece of case history. "He's better now," she said. "You should know that." She turned and walked back to stand beside Kayubong. The lead enforcer stood in the center of the room for a long time, looking at the wall, at the drawings, the suns with faces, the house with the outward opening door, the sea, the slow train, the 2 figures at the window. The inventory of a child's world rendered in primary colors and pressed to the wall with the conviction of someone who understood that the walls you live inside should reflect the life you intend to live. He reached into his jacket. Kayubong did not move. The lead enforcer placed something on the table. A phone. Unlocked, a number already on the screen, a number Kayubong recognized as belonging to Woo Sung-jin at the Hana Bank branch on Namdi Munro. "The accounts are intact," the lead enforcer said. His voice had lost the briefing quality entirely now. What remained was something younger, something that had been present before 4 years of architecture had been built over it. "I didn't touch them. I want you to know that." He straightened. He looked at Kayubong with the full, unmanaged complexity of a man who has done an irreversible thing, and has been living in the space between the doing and the reckoning ever since. "I need 30 days, he said, to arrange the transition in a way that doesn't collapse the Eastern Territory. 30 days, and then the structure is yours to do with as you decide." Kayubong looked at him for a long time. 20, he said, "and you come to Busan when it's done." The lead enforcer looked at the wall. At the sea, the invented horizon, the yellow marks across the blue, the gold that a child had drawn from nothing but a description and had gotten true without a reference. "What's in Busan?" he said. "The slow train," Kayubong said, "and a conversation about what we build next." The lead enforcer looked at Alyssa one more time. Something in his face completed the movement that had begun when she spoke to him, arrived at its destination, and settled there. He nodded. He left the room. Trisha released the wiring she had been holding. The full light caught. The room restored itself to its ordinary geography: the table, the chairs, the faded quilt, the wall. Alyssa turned to Kayubong. She pressed the stethoscope to his chest. She listened. Then she looked up with the expression of a physician delivering a final diagnosis. Complete, considered, carrying the full weight of the case history and its resolution. "Done arguing," she said. "Just talking now." Kayubong looked at her. At Trisha in the doorway, her hand still on the panel, watching them both with the expression of a woman who has spent 14 months being invisible and is in the process of understanding that invisibility was never the truth of what she was, only the condition she had been forced into, and conditions, unlike truths, can change. He looked at the wall one final time, the sea, the slow train, the two figures at the window and the light coming through. He reached into his shirt and removed the folded page from where he had placed it against the inside of the borrowed fabric, close to the arguing heart, during the lead enforcer's descent. He held it out to Alyssa. She took it, unfolded it, looked at the two figures on the slow train, herself and him, the window light, the invented horizon. She looked up. "You kept it," she said. "You told me to bring it back," he said. She refolded it with care. She placed it in the avocado bag, between the drawing pad and the thermometer with no batteries. She patted the bag once with the satisfied finality of a physician closing a case file that has reached its proper resolution. "Then you have to come back to return it," she said. The single bulb held its one setting above them. Outside, in the corridor, the building had returned to its ordinary language. The pipes, the distant elevator, the accumulated sound of lives proceeding in the ordinary way of lives that have not been altered by the events of a basement they are not aware of. And somewhere in the city, pointed south toward a coast that smelled of salt and looked like liquid gold when the light was right, the slow train was running. The slow train left Seoul at 6:47 in the morning. Not because 6:47 was a significant time, not because Kayubong had selected it with the operational precision he brought to departures that mattered. Because it was the slow train, and the slow train left when it left, on a schedule that had not been revised in 11 years and did not intend to begin now. Alyssa had confirmed this from the printed timetable she had requested 3 days prior, requested with the focused advance planning of someone who understood that significant events required preparation, and who had accordingly added the departure time to the top corner of a new drawing in careful, large numerals surrounded by a border of small stars. Trisha carried one bag. This had been its own quiet negotiation, the phone call to Woo Sungjin, who had received the Dragon Signet's presentation across a desk in the Hana Bank branch on Namdaemun Row, with the composure of a man who had been waiting for this specific call for 8 days, and had prepared accordingly. The accounts, the arrangements, the particular and comprehensive way that significant resources, properly directed, could reorganize the arithmetic of a life that had been running on the wrong numbers for too long. Trisha had sat across from Woo Sungjin with her hands folded in her lap, and her face arranged in the expression of a woman determined not to perform a reaction to information that was altering the fundamental geometry of her future, and she had mostly succeeded. She had cried once, in the bathroom of the Hana Bank branch, with the efficient privacy of a woman who understood that some things needed to be felt, and then filed so that the next thing could be faced clearly. She had come out and signed what needed signing. One bag, because the apartment at the bottom of the building contained almost nothing she needed to take, and everything she needed to leave behind was too large for luggage. Alyssa sat at the window. Kayubong had given her this position without discussion, had settled into the aisle seat with the matter-of-fact quality of a man making a decision, so obvious it did not require announcement. She had looked at him when he did it, and something in her look had contained the recognition of a gift being given in the language of people who do not make speeches about gifts. She had turned to the window and placed both hands flat on the glass, with the reverence of someone touching something they have been moving toward for a long time. Seoul released itself gradually as the train moved south, the dense, stacked architecture of the city thinning at its edges, the vertical ambition of it giving way by increments to the lower, more horizontal grammar of the outskirts, and then to the open language of the land beyond the city's reach. Fields, hills with their winter pale covering. The sky, which was a particular shade of early morning blue that the basement had not offered in the 8 months since Alyssa's birthday, doing its slow work of widening as the train placed distance between them and the structures that had compressed it. Alyssa narrated none of this. She watched it with the complete, receiving attention she brought to all significant things, her breath occasionally fogging the glass, her fingers leaving small prints that she did not wipe away, but allowed to accumulate as a record of the passage. Trisha watched her daughter watch the world with the expression she had worn in the Hana Bank bathroom, the one that required the efficient, private management of something too large for the available space, and said nothing, because nothing was the right thing. Kayubong looked at the back of Alyssa's head. He thought about 9 years old on this same line. The same widening sky, the same grammar of the land opening as the city released its grip. The boy he had been, who had chosen the slow train for the extra hour, without knowing that the extra hour would become the last quiet thing he carried into the years that followed, the last image of the world as something generous rather than something to be managed. He had managed it for 23 years. He was considering, with the particular consideration of someone doing it for the first time in a long time, what it might mean to stop. I have a complicated relationship with the word peace. It was never, in the vocabulary of my adult life, a state I associated with myself. Peace was the condition of people who had resolved their conflicts through surrender or exhaustion, a managed absence of war rather than the presence of something genuinely different. I had treated it the way I treated all absence, as a temporary condition preceding the next event. I sat on the slow train watching a child watch the world through a foggy window, and I understood something I had not had the framework to understand before. Peace is not the absence of the storm. It is what you find when you have finally stopped insisting that the storm is the only proof you exist. I am not a peaceful man. I want to be accurate about that. The things I did are not dissolved by 8 days in a basement or a child's stethoscope or a crayon drawing of a slow train. They are part of the accounting, and the accounting is long, and I am not at the end of it. But I was on the train. That is the beginning of a different sentence. The section outside Muryong arrived without announcement. One moment the view through the window was land, the particular winter-pale grammar of fields and low hills, unremarkable and real. Then the track curved, and the land gave way, and there it was. Alyssa went very still. The stillness was different from all her other stillnesses, different from the clinical stillness of assessment, from the professional stillness of someone managing a room with the authority of their attention. This was the stillness of a person whose entire inventory of prepared responses has been made inadequate by what they are encountering, and who has stopped managing their reaction because no management is sophisticated enough for the thing in front of them. The sea in winter light. The sun was at the angle. Kayubong had not planned this, had not calculated the departure time against the hour of arrival at this specific section of track, had not attempted to engineer the moment. But the light was exactly what it was when he had been 9 years old on this same train, and the surface of the water was doing what it did when the light was right, catching it and distributing it across the whole face of the water in the specific, inexplicable way that had no adequate comparison except itself. Liquid gold. Alyssa's hand found Kayubong's arm. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the window, on the water, on the gold moving across it in the slow, breathing rhythm of something larger than anything that breathes. But her hand found his arm and closed around it with the brief, total quality of contact that communicated, not words, not the grammar of a sentence, but something below language, something that arrived and was received in the register where the most significant things are transmitted. You told me the truth. He looked at the side of her face, at the light from the window catching the edges of her profile, the serious, composed face of a child who had looked at a bleeding monster in a doorway, and decided, with the full weight of whatever she was, that he was worth the trouble. He looked at her the way you look at something you have spent a long time being unable to see clearly, and are now seeing, for the first time, at the right distance and in the right light. Trisha was watching the water, too. Her face, in the window's reflection, the face of a woman who had been invisible for 14 months by practice and by necessity, and by the particular mathematics of a life that had run out of margin, was doing something he had not seen it do in the 8 days in the basement. Not the hunger-lie expression, not the managed composure of a woman determining in real time what the next 60 seconds required of her. Something else. Something that had been there before the invisibility had been required of her, and had survived it, intact, waiting. She was simply present. The water moved through the window and moved through them, and the train carried them south toward the coast. Blasian received them the way it always had, with the salt in the air arriving before the station, before the visual confirmation, the smell of it coming through the gaps in the trains, sealing with the insistence of something that does not wait to be formally introduced. Alyssa lifted her head from the window. She breathed in. She looked at Kayubong. He looked back at her. "Salt," she said. "Salt," he confirmed. She turned back to the window with the expression of a scientist confirming a hypothesis, not triumphant, not performed, just the clean satisfaction of a prediction meeting its evidence. The harbor was 20 minutes from the station on foot. Kayubong knew the route the way he knew the slow train's timetable, not from recent familiarity, but from the deep storage of a boy who had walked it enough times that the knowledge had settled below the level of conscious navigation and become simply a fact of his body. Left at the fish market. Down the hill, where the road narrowed and the buildings on either side got older and shorter and began to smell of rope and dried things and the particular accumulated history of a working waterfront. Then the wall at the end of the road, and the gate in the wall, and beyond the gate the harbor opening out. He had not been back in 23 years. The fish market had changed. The hill road had not. The gate was the same gate. He pushed it open. Alyssa went through first. She walked to the edge of the harbor with the focused, unhurried pace of someone covering the final distance to something they have been moving toward, and she stopped where the stone edge of the harbor met the water. She looked out. The Blasian winter harbor in the morning light, the fishing boats at their moorings, the water moving in its slow harbor grammar, and beyond the harbor mouth, the open sea catching the light in the way it caught it from the train window, the gold distributed across its surface in the patient, breathing rhythm of something that has been doing this since before there was anyone to watch it. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she opened the avocado bag. She removed the drawing pad. She sat down on the harbor stone with the deliberate purposefulness of someone beginning a significant piece of work, and she opened the pad to a clean page, and she began to draw. Kayubong stood beside Trisha and watched her daughter draw the sea from the sea itself, not from description, not from another drawing, but from the actual thing, in the actual light, with the actual salt in the air and the actual sound of it in the harbor's contained acoustics. "She's been preparing for this," Trisha said. Quietly, not to him specifically, not to anyone specifically, just speaking the thing into the salt air because the air was the right recipient for it. "I know," he said. They stood together in the easy quiet of people who have been through something together that does not require narration or summary, who share the full weight of the context without needing to rehearse it. After a while, Trisha said, "What happens now?" He had thought about this. On the train, in the days before the train, in the basement during the hours when the building was quiet and the single bulb maintained its one setting and Alyssa slept, and the accounting of what came next had been available for examination. He had thought about it with the same comprehensive attention he had brought to every significant strategic question of his adult life, and he had arrived at an answer that was shorter and less elaborate than the 23 years of questions preceding it. "Something different," he said. Trisha looked at him. "Something that doesn't require the bottom of a building," he said. "Something that Alyssa can see clearly when she's old enough to look back at it." He paused. "Something worth drawing." Trisha was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant reduction in scope," she said, "for a man who ran an empire." "The empire," he said, "was not worth drawing." Alyssa held up her drawing. "The sea from the sea, in blue and gold and the specific quality of direct observation, more complex than the first drawing, more precise, carrying information that description alone could not have provided. The boats, the harbor mouth, the light on the water rendered in overlapping yellow marks that had the quality of having been studied rather than imagined. And in the foreground, from behind, two adults standing at the harbor's edge, close but not touching, watching a child draw. She had drawn them while drawing the sea. She had been drawing them all along. She looked at Bong over the top of the page, with the evaluating attention of a craftsperson assessing a completed work. "I'm going to frame it," she said, "when we have a wall." He looked at the drawing, at the two figures in the foreground and the sea behind them, and the light that she had gotten true again, as she always got the essential things true, without a reference, working from what was real, trusting that the real was enough. His right hand, the dragon's signet. He looked at it for a moment, the gold, the scales, the 19 years of what it had meant, and what it had cost, and what it had built, and what it had required him to become in the building. He felt its weight on his finger with the full, honest inventory of everything that weight contained. He removed it. He held it in his palm for a moment, the harbor light catching it, the gold of it and the gold of the water occupying the same light for one breath. Then he placed it in the avocado bag. Not thrown, not dropped, placed with the care of someone putting something down in a location where it will be safe until it is needed for a different purpose, which was not yet determined, but which he trusted would become clear in the time available. Alyssa looked at his bare hand. She looked at the drawing. She looked at the wall of the harbor building behind them, the old stone of it, rough and salt-weathered, the kind of surface that had been holding its position since before anyone currently standing near it had been born. "That wall would hold a frame," she said. Bung looked at the wall. He looked at his bare hand. He looked at his physician, 7 years old, salt in her hair, crayon on her fingers, the stethoscope around her neck and the avocado bag over her shoulder, sitting on a Busan Harbor stone in the morning light of a winter that was already beginning, by the particular evidence of the light, to become something else. The storm, which had been running for 23 years with the relentless, structural patience of something that had decided it, was the permanent condition of his life, was quiet. Not gone. He was not in the business of claiming things were gone when they were restructured. But quiet, the particular quality of quiet that is not the absence of the storm, but its aftermath, the air after, the particular clarity of a world that has been scoured and is now available for what comes next. He sat down on the harbor stone beside her. She passed him a crayon. "Blue." He looked at it, at his hand wrapped around it, the tattooed knuckles, the bare finger where the ring had been, the hand that had signed death warrants and negotiated empires and could not, 8 days ago on a faded quilt, close its fingers around a plastic toy. He pressed the crayon to the page she had opened for him. He drew a line. Horizontal, the horizon. Alyssa looked at it with the evaluating attention of her full professional regard. "Good," she said, the word she used for hearts that were still talking and wounds oriented in the right direction. Not perfect, not finished. Better. The harbor moved in its slow, breathing rhythm around them, and the gold was on the water. And behind them, Trisha sat down on the stone too, and the three of them were present in the morning light of Blasian, at the edge of the sea that smelled like nothing else and sounded like a heartbeat without a name. The storm was quiet. The drawing was not finished. Both of these things were, for the first time in 23 years, exactly right.